This green-haired kid hosted a galaxy-sized firebird at 10 years old and didn't lose his goddamn mind. Until he almost did. Deku went full god mode, unmade the biggest villain in history, and kept his humanity. Shit's emotional as fuck. And epic.
Welcome, Legends, to Chronos Recom. I wrote this story myself, so if you have any suggestions or what-ifs you want to see, drop it in the comments below. Also, just wanted to let you know I've got a Patreon set up now for anyone who wants to support the channel directly. You can get early access to stories, submit direct fan requests, and get exclusive content. It's totally optional, but if you want to help keep these stories coming, check it out. Links in the description. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Let's dive into this story.
The boy sat at the edge of his bed at 3 in the morning and listened to a star die. It happened a long way off, in a corner of the universe that had nothing to do with Shizuoka or Japan or Earth, and it did not know him. Yet he heard it. He heard everything. The collapse of a stellar core sounded like a cathedral falling underwater, slow and full of pressure, and behind it came the choir of other things, the hum of magnetic fields wrapping a dying world, the static of radio bursts older than mammals, like the screaming of a galactic cluster grinding against another one a billion light years away. Izuku Midoriya pressed his palms flat against his ears. It did nothing. The sound was inside him. He was 15 years old. He had been the host of the Phoenix Force for 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days. He had counted. Counting was one of the small tricks he used to keep himself anchored to the floor of his bedroom, instead of drifting through the radio noise of creation. The floor was real. The blanket was real. The faint thrum of his mother breathing in the next room was real. The cup of cooling tea on his nightstand was real. He recited these objects in his mind like a prayer rope, and slowly, by degrees, the cathedral underwater faded back into the background of his consciousness, where it always lived now. He looked at his hands. They were ordinary boy's hands, calloused along the knuckles from years of physical training, scarred along the right thumb from a kitchen accident at age 12, fingernails bitten down because anxiety had survived godhood. He could turn these hands into furnaces hot enough to burn through battleship hull. He had decided, at 6 in the morning on his 11th birthday, that he would never do that unless somebody he loved was about to die. He had kept that promise. 5 years, 3 months, 11 days. The boy lay back in his bed and watched the ceiling and thought about how this had all begun. His mother's name was Izuku Midoriya, and her quirk was the smallest, most polite ability in their entire neighborhood. She could pull a stray pen toward her hand if it was within a meter. She had used it mostly to find lost socks and to lift her glasses off the coffee table when she did not feel like getting up. She used to laugh about how unremarkable she was. The doctors said her quirk's molecular signature was inherited cleanly from her own mother, who had been able to call little objects from across a kitchen. Quirks tended to settle into family lines like that, weaker each generation, smaller each generation, until eventually a great-grandchild was born with nothing at all. Then Inko gave birth to her son, and the geneticists at Tokyo Metropolitan Children's Hospital ran the blood panel and went very still. Whatever had happened inside Izuku's nervous system in the womb, it had not settled smaller. It had folded over and over on itself, like origami built from a single ribbon of his mother's tiny ability, and emerged on the other side as something the registration office had no word for. They wrote telekinesis on the form and circled it twice. They asked his mother to come back when the child began to manifest. They did not expect him to manifest much. He manifested at age 4 by lifting a sedan. He had been chasing a soccer ball into the street. A car had been turning the corner. His mother had screamed his name and reached for him with both hands, the way every mother does at the edge of disaster. The car never reached him. It floated. It hung 2 feet off the pavement, idling. The driver's mouth open in soundless shock. Izuku had been 4 years old, standing in the middle of the street with one finger pointed at the front bumper, his eyes wide in startled curiosity. He set the car back down. He apologized to the driver. He walked home holding his mother's hand and asked her if he was in trouble. She had not let go of his hand for the rest of that day. She did the only thing she knew how to do. She held him through it. By 6, he was casually moving things he should never have been able to move. Refrigerators, parked motorcycles, the entire jungle gym at the local park when the smaller children had wanted to see it rotate. He never showed off. He hated showing off. He showed off only because adults asked him to, and even then, he kept his eyes lowered and his answers short. The teachers all noticed how mild he was for somebody who could fold steel. The neighborhood mothers all whispered about him on benches. The other children mostly stayed away. He was the boy who could move buildings. That was a hard thing to befriend. By 8, the migraines began. They were the kind of headache that bent the world. He would walk into a room and feel his skull tightening at the temples and try to think of nothing, and the harder he tried, the worse it got. He once put a hairline fracture through his bedroom wall by reading a chapter of a comic book in the wrong mood. The neurologists pulled scans and stared at them and used words like anomalous psychic broadcast and involuntary projection. They prescribed sedatives. The sedatives made his thoughts slow without making them softer. He learned to breathe through it. He learned to find very small things to look at when the pressure rose, a beetle on a window, a thread on his sleeve, the curve of his mother's earring, and to anchor himself to the small thing until the pressure passed. Most of the time it worked. Most of the time was about to stop being enough. He was 10 years old, on a summer evening so warm it felt like sleeping inside a breath. He was walking home through the woods behind his house, because the woods were where the air did not press as hard against his head as the city did. His mother had told him to be home by sunset. The sky had been the color of an orange peel. The cicadas had been so loud he had heard them through the static in his ears. The streak came down out of the western sky. He saw it before anyone else did. He saw it because he was already looking up. He had been watching a hawk circle above the tree line, and the streak appeared above the hawk, like somebody had drawn a line of fire from horizon to horizon with one stroke of a gold pen. It was the color of a sunrise melting through honey. It was the size of a comet. It came down fast enough that the air around it screamed, and then it was on top of him, and then it was past him, and then the earth detonated. Trees flattened. The hawk vanished. A wall of pressure hit Izuku in the chest and sent him rolling backward through pine needles, and he came up half conscious, half deaf, with the entire western half of the forest leveled into a glowing crater the width of a soccer field. The seismic shock would later be measured 4 prefectures away. Tokyo television trucks would be on scene within 30 minutes. By then it would be over. He stood up. He should have run. He did the opposite. He walked toward the crater. Something in the back of his skull was pulling him forward by a thread he could not see and could not break. It was a sensation he had no language for at 10 years old. He would later describe it when therapists asked as the feeling of being recognized, as if a thing he had never met had already known him, had been looking for him across distances his small brain could not picture, and had found him the way a magnet finds iron in the dark. He came to the edge of the crater. The molten ground glowed orange-red like a wound. In the center of the crater stood a bird. It was not a bird. It was a shape that the air had decided to make in the rough silhouette of a raptor, because the air did not know what else to do with the thing that had just landed inside it. Its wings were folded gold flame. Its eyes were not eyes. They were holes through which other places looked out. Its size shifted as he watched. Sometimes the size of a falcon, sometimes the size of a cathedral, and the part of his mind that knew how to be afraid had simply gone offline. He was empty of fear. He was full of an aching, awful gravity. The bird opened its wings. A voice that was not a voice spoke to him in a language he had been born already knowing. It said, "Child, I have been searching." It said, "Your mind is wide enough." It said, "I have crossed worlds to find a host who would not break." It said, "Finally, will you carry me?" He was 10 years old. He did not understand half of what he was being asked. He understood the half he needed to. He nodded. The fire entered him. He would remember the next several minutes for the rest of his life. He would remember them in fragments because no single mind was built to hold them in sequence. He would remember the inside of his ribs lighting up like stained glass. He would remember a chorus of voices rushing in through the new opening at the back of his head. The death songs of stars, the static crackle of black holes feeding, the dreams of beings that had been ancient when his planet was still molten rock. He would remember the way his telekinesis blossomed open inside the floodwater of that arrival, going from a heavy, blunt force into something fine enough to feel the atomic lattice of a pine needle. He would remember the moment when he understood in his bones that he could disassemble anything in the universe down to its base components if he wanted to. He would remember the moment when he understood that the entity inside him wanted him to want to. He would remember, most clearly of all, falling to his knees and weeping into the loam of a burning forest, while a god the size of a galaxy curled itself smaller and smaller until it could fit inside the chest of a 10-year-old boy. His mother found him there at nightfall. She had been calling his name through the trees for hours. She had been crying so hard her voice was hoarse. She had been ready to find him dead. She found him alive instead, sitting in the cooling crater with his eyes glowing faintly gold, his hair lifted in a current of warm air that came from nowhere, and the molten earth beneath him already crusting into glassy black ribbons. He had looked up at her and said, "Mama, I think something happened." She had wrapped him in her arms and not let him go for an hour. She had held him through it. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. The government men came the next morning. They were polite. They wore dark suits and spoke softly and used phrases that were meant to a mother feel safer than she had any right to feel. There were programs, they said. There were specialists. There were people who could help. They knew about the crater. They knew about her son. They wanted to help. They tried. They tried for 5 years. The specialists were good people. They were sincere. They simply lacked the vocabulary for what had walked into Izuku's chest. They handed him meditation worksheets, while a god ate suns inside his skull. They taught him breathing exercises while the radio static of dying galaxies played behind his eardrums. They told him to journal his feelings. He journaled. The journals helped a little. Most things helped a little. Nothing helped enough. He found his own ways. He found that running until his lungs burned helped because his body filled with adrenaline that drowned out the radio. He found that holding very small objects with his telekinesis, a single grain of rice balanced in the air half an inch above his palm, helped because the precision required to hold something so small without crushing it forced his mind to a single point. He found that his mother's hand on his back helped. He found that her voice helped. He found that the smell of her cooking helped him to benefit, and the sound of her crying when she thought he was asleep made him put a brick down on his own anger and never lift it, because if he ever lifted it, he was afraid of what would come out from under it. He grew into a boy who was very, very still. He stood with his hands at his sides. He looked at people when they spoke and let them finish. He laughed when something was actually funny and did not laugh when something was not. He was warm with his mother and warm with the very few people who had decided to be his friends, and to everyone else, he was a polite, level-eyed boy with green hair and freckles who looked younger than 15 and weighed more than the building he stood in. He was admitted to UA High School on the strength of an entrance exam that would be discussed at 3 different government ministries for the rest of the year. That story comes a little later. Before that, there was a girl. The Joint Mental Wellness Seminar was a program run cooperatively between the major hero academies. The premise was that powerful young people often carried powerful psychological loads, and that students of different schools could benefit from sharing experiences in a structured environment. The premise was sound. The execution was a stuffy conference room in a hotel near the UA campus with folding chairs in a circle and a facilitator who used the phrase, "Let's lean into that." Izuku had been required to attend by his case manager. The room was full of teenagers from UA, Shiketsu, and Ketsubutsu. He had taken a seat near the door because the door was a useful thing to be near. He had folded his hands in his lap. He had listened. He had said nothing. It was a Shiketsu boy with a quirk for accelerating plant growth who had triggered it. The boy had described, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound steady, the time his quirk had crawled up the throat of a teammate during a training exercise and almost suffocated her before he had managed to pull it back. The room had filled with the kind of silence that follows somebody admitting a true thing. In that silence, Izuku had felt the phoenix stir. The stirring was familiar. It came when his sympathy spiked, because empathy was an emotional state, and emotional states fed the entity. The boy across the circle had said the words, "I almost killed her," and Izuku had felt those words inside his own chest. He had felt them very strongly. He had felt the phoenix register the spike and lift its head from its long sleep at the back of his skull. The radio static climbed. He breathed in. He counted his anchors, the chair, the carpet, the window. The static did not back off. He counted again. The chair, the carpet, the window, my mother, my hands. The static rose. The pressure built behind his eyes. He felt the air in the room change temperature, the smallest fraction of a degree warmer, the smallest current beginning to circulate around him. The student to his left looked over, then the student to his right. Then the facilitator stopped talking. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered. One of them popped, a small, bright burst of glass that the facilitator flinched at. The ceiling tiles in a 6-foot ring around Izuku's chair began to vibrate. He stood up. He was sorry. He tried to say he was sorry. He could feel his control sliding sideways, and he was trying to get to the door and outside, away from the people, where the worst of it would only level a parking lot, and the air in the room thickened around him like the inside of a held breath. The carpet under his shoes scorched in a small black ring. The chair behind him crumpled in on itself without anyone touching it. The students moved away. They moved away as one organism, sliding their chairs back, drawing a wider and wider circle around the boy in the middle, because all of them were trained enough to feel what was happening, even if none of them had the language to name it. The facilitator was saying something in a voice that was high and panicked. Izuku could not hear her. He could hear the cathedral underwater. He could hear the choir. He could hear his own heart hammering inside the static, very small. The girl walked toward him. She was not in his class. He had not noticed her before. She was wearing the Shiketsu uniform with the high black collar and the wide hat tipped back on her head, and she had blonde hair cut to her shoulders and a face he would have called bored if he had been able to focus on faces in that moment. She walked across the circle the other students had drawn, stepped into the radius of melting carpet, and stopped a foot in front of him. She tilted her head. She looked at him the way somebody looks at a friend who has had a long day. "Hey," she said. "Hey, you're like super not vibing right now." He stared at her. His eyes were beginning to gold over. He could see her through a faint shimmer of heat haze. Cool. Cool. Cool, cool. Okay. She lifted both hands, palms out like he was a horse she was approaching. "Hi, I'm Kami. Low-key gonna do a thing, fam. It is 100% for your benefit. You're gonna feel better in 5 seconds. Pinky promise. Just breathe." She exhaled. A cloud of soft pink smoke rolled out of her mouth and over him. The room dropped away. He was standing on a beach. The smoke had carried him into an illusion so complete that his every sense reported the new environment as real. The sand under his shoes was warm. The air was salty. The sky above him was a black bowl full of stars, and the stars were stars, single points of light, separated from each other by the velvet of an actual night sky instead of the screaming static of a real one. Waves came in at his ankles. A breeze tugged at his hair. The temperature was perfect. The cathedral underwater stopped. The choir stopped. The phoenix retreated. For the first time in 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days, Izuku Midoriya stood inside silence. He fell to his knees on the warm sand. He pressed both hands against his face. He was breathing in great, sobbing, open-mouthed gulps, the way a drowning swimmer breathes when their head breaks the surface. He did not care that there were strangers watching him do it. Inside the illusion, there were no strangers. Inside the illusion, the universe had finally, mercifully, shut up. Kami sat down next to him on the sand. She crossed her legs. She rested her elbows on her knees. She watched the illusory waves come in and out for a moment as if she was thinking about whether to take her shoes off and decide against it. Then she looked at him sideways. You looked like you had a lot on your mind, fam, she said. Like, major bad vibes. Better now? He laughed. It came out half laugh, half sob, ragged and surprised. He had not laughed in weeks. The sound startled him. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and looked at her, and he saw her properly for the first time. Sharp brown eyes, a mouth that turned up at one corner, an expression that was kind in a way he had been afraid to hope for. Yeah, he said. His voice came out hoarse. Yeah. A lot better. Cool, that's good. She nodded as if she had just gotten a satisfactory weather report. So what was that? Because I've seen people lose it before, like plenty, but yours was kind of giving end-of-the-world energy. Low-key scary, babe. Like, the whole room felt smaller, you know? He tried to find a word for it. It's loud, in my head, all the time. It's been loud for 5 years. Loud how? Loud like a star dying. She blinked at him. She processed that. She did not flinch. She did not ask him to clarify. She simply nodded slowly as if filing it away for later. Well, she said, loud like a star dying. Okay, that's a lot. Yeah. And this, she waved her hand at the beach, is quiet. He could not speak. He nodded. Babe, she said softly. Babe, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. She did not say it in a tragic voice. She said it the same way she had said hey a minute earlier. Casually warm. Honest. She reached over and put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades the way a friend might. He felt the weight of it through his uniform, and he felt the absurd, ridiculous relief of being touched by somebody who was not afraid of him. How long can you hold this? He asked. His voice was small. My glamour? Like an hour if I commit. More if I really commit. I can basically chill here with you as long as you want, fam. An hour. Yeah. He closed his eyes. He let the waves come in for the full hour. She sat with him for the full hour. She did not fill it with talking. She talked when he wanted to talk and went silent when he wanted silence. And somewhere in the middle of the silent stretches, he felt a small and terrifying thing happen inside his chest. A knot he had been carrying since he was 10 unwound itself by one turn, because somebody had finally walked into the worst part of him without flinching, and had sat down on a beach, and had said, better now? When she finally let the illusion drop, the seminar room had been evacuated. The chairs were scattered. The fluorescent lights were dead. Somebody had hit the fire alarm. Kami and Izuku were the only two people still in the room, and the facilitator was outside arguing with hotel staff. Kami stood up, brushed non-existent sand off her skirt, and offered him her hand. So she said, what's your name, Mr. End of the World? Izuku, he said. Izuku Midoriya. Cool, Izuku. She rolled the name around in her mouth. Pleasure. I'm Kami Utsushimi, Shiketsu's second year, illusion girl, your new best friend, congrats. He stared at her. That last part, she added, wasn't a request, fam. Sorry, it's already done. You should have run when you had the chance. He laughed again. It was easier the second time. They walked out of the hotel together. They exchanged numbers in the parking lot. She made him promise to text her if the loudness got bad. He promised. He did not break the promise. From that day forward, when the radio static climbed past the line where his anchors stopped working, he would put his phone to his ear and Kami would breathe a small pocket of pink smoke into the speaker. And it would carry through somehow. Her glamour traveled along the bond they were beginning to build like a current down a wire, and a half-second of beach would slip into his head, and the cathedral would go silent for 10 minutes. And that was enough. Most days, that was enough. His mother met Kami a week later over dinner at the Midoriya apartment. Inko cried halfway through the meal. She tried not to. She failed. She reached across the table and held Kami's hand and said thank you in a voice so soft it almost was not there. And Kami, who was generally the loudest thing in any room, said, Auntie, please, it's my pleasure. He's a whole vibe, I'm obsessed, and Inko laughed through her tears. And that was the night Kami became a fixture in their lives. Not a guest, a fixture. The UA entrance exam was 3 months later. He stood at the gates of the practice city in a white t-shirt and dark track pants. There were 200 other applicants around him, stretching, fidgeting, talking too loud to cover their nerves. He stood with his hands in his pockets and watched the gate. Kami was at home, almost certainly checking her phone every 90 seconds for an update. His mother had hugged him 3 times before he left and then waved him out the door with her eyes wet. He had told both of them he would be fine. He had meant it. He had also been afraid. He was almost always afraid. He had learned to fold the fear small and keep it in the same pocket as his keys. Beside him, a girl with white hair and pale skin like fog was murmuring something under her breath. Her name tag said Yanagi, Reiko. She was rotating a single small stone above her open palm, an inch off the skin the way a fidget toy rotates. He recognized the technique. Poltergeist users. Telekinesis, narrow band, light objects, mid-range. She caught him watching, and the stone stopped rotating, and she dipped her head in a small bow. He bowed back. He did not say anything. She did not seem to expect him to. The voice on the loudspeaker barked the start command. The gates rolled open. 200 teenagers poured into the practice city. Izuku walked. He did not run. He walked. He had decided weeks earlier that he would do this with the least demonstration possible. He would clear what he needed to clear, score what he needed to score, and stay invisible. He walked toward the central square at a pace that would have been embarrassing for any other applicant. Around him, other students sprinted past, shouting funny quirks, lighting up explosions and ice walls and pillars of stone. He watched them work. He admired them in passing. He kept walking. He turned a corner and found 3 two-point robots already in the middle of an intersection, grinding toward a cluster of fleeing applicants. He stopped walking. He raised one finger. The 3 robots lifted off the pavement. He held them suspended at the height of a second-story window. He did not strain. He did not even square his shoulders. He had been holding more than this in his sleep for years. The applicants beneath the robots stopped fleeing and looked up, and their faces went through the sequence of surprise into bewilderment, into the special kind of horror that comes from realizing somebody has just made your entire ability obsolete. 2 more two-point robots rolled in from a side street. He flicked his finger. They lifted up to join the others. He had 5 robots floating in a tight cluster in the air over the intersection. Immobile, their tank treads spinning uselessly. He looked at them for a moment as if considering them. Then he closed his hand into a loose fist. The 5 robots compacted inward. Steel screamed. Plating folded into plating. Treads twisted into the cracks between hull plates. The 5 robots collapsed into a single tight cube of compressed metal scrap roughly the size of an oven, and the cube hung in the air over the intersection in the sudden, ringing silence. He set the cube down on the pavement. It landed with a single dense thud. The crack in the asphalt under it spread in a small starburst. The applicants beneath stared. He smiled at them politely. "Sorry," he said. "I'll get out of your way." He kept walking. Reiko Yanagi had been on the rooftop 2 blocks away. She had heard the metallic groan all the way across the city, and she had turned in time to see the cube come down. She had a small stone rotating in front of her chest, her own preferred working object. The stone fell out of the air and hit her shoe. She did not bend down to pick it up. She stood on the rooftop and stared in the direction of the intersection with her mouth slightly open. She would later tell her therapist that she had spent the next 90 seconds questioning every decision she had made about her own quirk for the previous 16 years. Izuku kept walking through the city. He cleared robots at a steady pace. He did it the same way each time. He lifted them, compressed them, set them down. He moved on. He had stopped showing off years ago. There was nothing inside him to perform. The point of the exam was to demonstrate enough capability to be admitted, and he intended to demonstrate enough and then exactly enough. Around him, the city filled with sound, explosions, ice, the shouts of other students racking up their own scores. He let it wash past him. He climbed a low set of stairs at the side of a faux office building so that he could see more of the grid. From the elevation, he watched the dots of other applicants move through the streets like ants. He watched one of them, a boy with a tail and excellent reflexes, take down a one-pointer with a kick. He watched a girl in a frog-themed costume hop along the side of a building, taking robots out with her tongue. He watched the whole thing with the same warm, separated attention he gave to a movie he was enjoying. He had nearly forgotten he was being tested. Then the ground shook. He felt the rumble in the soles of his feet before he heard it. It was the wrong kind of shake. It was steady and heavy, the rhythm of something very large taking very large steps. He turned his head. The zero-pointer came around a corner 2 blocks away. It was the size of a small office building. Its head scraped the underside of the elevated train track it walked beneath. Its sensor array swept across the city street and locked on a target. Izuku followed the line of the sensors with his eyes and his stomach dropped. There was a girl on the pavement, 2 blocks down. Round face, short brown hair, pink rosy cheeks. She had been jumping along the rooftops earlier. He had seen her doing it. Gravity quirk, light footwork. She had landed badly. She was on the asphalt holding her ankle. Her face was pale. She could not move. The zero-pointer was walking toward her at a speed that would put it on top of her in 20 seconds. Other applicants had already begun running in the opposite direction. Some had stopped and turned to watch, frozen. Nobody was running toward her. Izuku felt the phoenix lift its head. It was not the way it lifted in the seminar room. That had been a slow stirring of an animal nudged awake. This was something else. This was the entity recognizing a use for itself. This was a god the size of a galaxy looking down through the eyes of a 15-year-old boy and seeing prey it could end. Heat rolled up through his sternum. The radio static came back, but the static this time had a current to it, a direction, a pulling forward. He did not fight it. He did not have time. He moved. The students who saw him later would all describe the same thing, slightly differently. Some of them said he leaped. Some said he flew. The truth was that he had stepped off the stair he was standing on and continued upward in a straight diagonal line, his shoes leaving the ground at the same speed his feet would have taken him along the pavement, except now he was rising. He covered 2 blocks in 2 seconds. He stopped in midair at the height of a 3rd-story window, directly between the girl on the ground and the zero-pointer. He hung there, his feet pointed at nothing. His arms were loose at his sides. Around him, the air shimmered. The pavement beneath him sagged inward in a soft cone, the way a trampoline sags under weight. His green hair lifted slowly off his forehead and floated in the slow current of his own aura. And his eyes, which until then had been ordinary boy's eyes, large and dark green and a little tired, opened wider. And the color in them caught fire. The phoenix spread inside him. It manifested behind him as a shape, the human eye, registered before the human brain could process. It was a bird the size of a building. It was the silhouette of wings drawn in living gold. It was a halo of feathers made of furnace light, each individual feather as long as a city bus. The heat it radiated was enough that the windows of the buildings beside him began to ripple. The clouds over the city flinched. The zero-pointer raised its primary armament. Izuku tilted his head. He said it out loud. He did not know why. The phoenix wanted him to say it. He wanted to say it. It was the truth of his entire life, and the truth was rising up his throat the way the heat was rising up his chest. I have to work harder than anyone else to make it. The voice doubled on the last word. His own teenage voice underneath, the layered chorus of the entity above, both speaking the same words at once. The sound rolled out over the intersection like thunder rolling out from a strike that had already happened. He pointed it at the zero-pointer. What came out of him was not exactly a beam. It was not exactly fire. It was a focused line of golden burning that ate the air it passed through and ignored physics on its way to the target. It struck the zero-pointer at the sternum and traveled upward, and what it touched ceased to be metal. The top half of the robot, sensors, head, primary armament, support struts, the entire upper assembly, turned to vapor in a fraction of a second. The vapor itself burned. The vapor became gas. The gas became plasma. The plasma rose in a column of golden light that punched straight up into the sky for 2,000 meters, and the clouds above the practice city, gray, heavy, full of the morning's leftover rain, simply disappeared. They unmade themselves. A clear blue circle opened above the city as wide as the horizon, and the air in the circle was still warm, and the air at the edges of the circle was being pulled inward to fill the absence, and for a moment the entire weather pattern over central Japan recalculated itself. The bottom half of the zero-pointer remained standing. Then its supports failed. It toppled sideways and crashed into a building, which caught it, groaning. Izuku descended. He came on slowly, more slowly than he had risen, his feet finding the asphalt with a softness that suggested he was setting himself down rather than landing. He stood in the small crater his own descent had pressed into the pavement. The phoenix folded its wings back into him. The radio static dimmed. The fire in his eyes faded. The heat haze around him collapsed, and the world rushed back in to fill the space. He was trembling. He looked at his hands. They were still his hands. They were still ordinary boy's hands. He turned. The girl with the brown hair was staring at him with her mouth open. He walked over to her. He knelt. He placed his fingers an inch above her sprained ankle and concentrated, and the small bones in her ankle, which had shifted out of place, slid back into alignment with the gentle pressure of his telekinesis adjusting them. He had practiced this on his mother's wrist. He was good at it. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. She could not seem to speak. "You should get to a medical station." He helped her up. "There's one back by the entrance. Can you walk?" She nodded again. She took a step. She did not fall. "Good," he said. He gave her a small smile. "Good luck on the rest of the exam." He turned and he walked back the way he had come. In the observation room above the practice city, the UA faculty had been watching the exam through a wall of monitors. The monitors had all gone white when the beam fired, and most of them had stayed white for several seconds afterward as the camera sensors recovered. When the picture finally returned, the entire room of pro heroes and administrators was silent. Recovery Girl had her hand pressed to her mouth. Midnight had stopped mid-sentence. Cementos was leaning forward with his hands flat on the console in front of him. Nezu, in his small chair at the central console, had folded his small paws across his stomach and was watching the recovering picture with an expression that was utterly unreadable. All Might, in his thin, untransformed form, was the only one of them still standing. He was staring at the screen with both eyes wide, blue and brilliant in his shrunken face, and the hand he had pressed against his mouth was shaking, and he was trying very hard to keep his expression closed, and he was failing. "Aizawa," on the far side of the room, said the first words anybody managed to say. "Well," he said, "that settles the admissions debate." Nezu turned his small head a fraction. "Indeed." "Should we be concerned?" Cementos asked. Nezu considered. "We should be honest with ourselves about what concerned even means in this context." The boy controlled it. He came down. He healed the other applicant. He is operating at a level that none of us can match, and he is choosing to be a hero. Concern is an emotion that asks us to evaluate whether something can be stopped. I find it more useful to ask what kind of school we want to be when a child like this walks into our classroom. The room said nothing. All Might lowered his hand from his mouth. He sat down. He was already shrinking inside his own thoughts. He had recognized something in the boy on the screen. He had recognized the look of someone who had stood beside a thing larger than himself for a long time and had decided to carry it without putting it down. "He has a 100% rescue score," Recovery Girl said, looking at the readout. "He cleared 64 robots, including the zero-pointer, and he stopped to set a sprained ankle for a fellow applicant." "Admitted," Nezu said. He waved his small paw. "Obviously admitted. Top of the year." "Top of the decade," Aizawa muttered. He sounded tired. He always sounded tired. The corners of his mouth, however, had moved upward by an almost invisible margin. "Top of the century, probably. Top of the list of things I will lose sleep over." The monitors continued playing back the slow-motion replay. The phoenix bird spread its wings again on screen. The faculty all stared at the same image and thought their own thoughts. Outside the window, the clear blue circle in the sky over the practice city was slowly filling back in with clouds, but very slowly, as if the weather itself was still deciding what it wanted to do. Izuku came home that evening to find his mother and Kami sitting at the kitchen table. They both looked up when he walked in. Kami had her phone in her hand. Inko had a kitchen towel twisted between hers. The news was on the television in the next room, and on the news there was a satellite image of an opening in the cloud cover over the UA practice city. "So," Kami said. "Hi," Izuku said. "Hi, fam." She set the phone down. "Hi. How did it go, sweetheart?" his mother said. Her voice was already brimming. He did not know how to answer. He looked at the television. He looked back at the two of them. "I think I'm admitted," he said. His mother burst into tears and stood up and crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around him before he could finish setting his bag down. Kami laughed and got up and joined the hug from the other side, and Izuku stood in the middle of their two bodies with his face pressed into his mother's hair and Kami's chin tucked into his shoulder. And the cathedral underwater in his head was very far away tonight, and he thought, for one of the first times in his life, that maybe he was going to be all right. He was wrong, but he was right enough for the moment. The first week at UA was a series of small adjustments. He took a seat in Class 1A near the window. He greeted the people who greeted him. He did not greet people who did not greet him first, because he had learned over years that hovering around strangers tended to make them more uncomfortable. He spoke when spoken to. He answered questions in class with short, accurate answers. He let the room build its own picture of him. The room built a picture, all right? It built several. There was the boy named Sero, who decided immediately that Izuku was approachable and started chatting with him at lunch, asking him about his quirk in the open, friendly way of somebody who did not yet understand what he was asking about. There was the girl named Asui, who watched him for 3 days with patient, frog-like eyes, and then walked up and said, "Midoriya, you are very strong and very polite. I am going to call you Midori. I hope that is fine." There was Ida, who had introduced himself with a bow and a hand chop, and had then spent the next 4 days correcting Izuku's posture in a way that Izuku found genuinely endearing. There was Uraraka, the girl from the entrance exam, the one whose ankle he had set, who had thrown both arms around him in the hallway on the second day and thanked him until her face was as red as her cheeks, and who had then, embarrassed, run off down the hall while everybody stared. There was Tokoyami, who had inclined his beaked head when they were introduced and had said, in a voice that was lower and more thoughtful than Izuku expected, "Midoriya. I feel I should mention that my familiar finds your presence unsettling. Please do not take offense." Izuku had bowed back. "Tell Dark Shadow I'm sorry. I'll try to dim it down when I'm near him." Tokoyami had paused. Then he had smiled, in his way. He says he would appreciate that. There was, also, Bakugo Katsuki. Bakugo had been in Izuku's middle school. They had grown up on the same street. Bakugo had spent every year of their shared childhood the louder, the angrier, the more aggressive one. And Izuku had spent every year of their shared childhood being mild, being polite, being the boy who would never use his quirk to put a peer down, because his quirk was at a level where putting anybody down was not a fair fight. The result had been an awkward equilibrium. Bakugo had grown up believing himself the strongest student in their grade. Izuku had grown up letting him believe it, because Izuku had had bigger things to manage than another boy's ego. The equilibrium had collapsed the moment Bakugo had walked into Class 1A and seen Izuku already seated. It had collapsed harder when the entrance exam scores had been read aloud. Izuku, 64 robots and 1 0-pointer. Bakugo, 24 robots and 0 0-pointers, because Bakugo had not been near the 0-pointer when it appeared. The faculty had said the names in alphabetical order, and Izuku's score had landed before Bakugo's, and Bakugo's eyes had locked on the back of Izuku's head with the kind of stare that had a smell. Smoke. Sulfur. Old, banked anger ready to flare. Izuku had felt it. He had said nothing. He had decided to let Bakugo work out his own arithmetic. The battle trial came on the 4th day. All Might announced it in his hero form, with all the booming theater that the man could not seem to help. They would pair up, villains versus heroes. Indoor training environment. 2-on-2, bring everything they had. The pairing slips came around. Izuku drew villain. He looked at the slip beside his name. Bakugo, he sighed. He had hoped it would be later. He had hoped it would be in a controlled context, with cooling pads and barriers, and faculty supervision designed for a real confrontation. 2-on-2 combat exercise on the 4th day of class was the worst possible venue because the venue was small and the supervision was a man in spandex watching from a control booth. He met Bakugo in the corridor outside the training building. Bakugo had his hands in his pockets. He was rocking on the balls of his feet. His mouth was a hard, flat line, and his red eyes were fixed on Izuku with the focus of a hunting dog. "You and me," Bakugo said. "Looks like it. Don't hold back." Izuku paused. He looked at him. He spoke without heat. If I don't hold back, you're going to die. Please understand that. I am asking you to hold back. I am going to hold back. Bakugo's lip lifted. It was an expression of pure derision. Fuck you, Bakugo. Fuck you. Bakugo took his hands out of his pockets. He flexed them. Small pops of nitroglycerin sweat sparked between his fingers. You think I don't know what you did out there with that 0-pointer? You think the whole class doesn't know? You think I missed all of it for 13 years? You sat next to me in middle school looking like you were sorry to be in the room. Sorry, like I was the gift you were too polite to refuse. The whole damn time you were sitting on whatever the hell that was, watching me sweat. Pretending. I'm going to break that pretending in half today. You understand me? Izuku watched him. You're angry, he said. You're damn right I'm angry. You should be. He said it gently. I won't pretend. I'm sorry. I should have told you what I was a long time ago. I didn't know how. I still don't, really. I'm sorry. Bakugo's face went a complicated color because Bakugo had been ready for a fight and had instead been handed an apology, and the apology had taken his footing out from under him for a quarter second. The quarter second passed. The anger flooded back. Don't, he said. Don't apologize to me. Don't pity me. Don't look at me like that. I'm going to blow your damn face off and we'll see how sorry you are afterward. He walked into the training building. Izuku stood in the corridor for a long moment. He breathed in. He breathed out. He had felt the phoenix lift its head when Bakugo had said, I'm going to blow your damn face off. And he had pressed it back down, and he had felt it press up against the lid of his self-control with a strength he had only felt a handful of times before. He flexed his hands. He told himself the exercise would last 10 minutes. 10 minutes. He could hold a god still for 10 minutes. He had held one still for years. He walked into the training building. The exercise had two objectives on either side. The hero pair, Ida and Uraraka, had to retrieve a bomb prop from the building's upper floor. The villain pair, Izuku and Bakugo, had to defend it. Izuku had been planning a small misdirection. He had been planning to use his telekinesis to make Ida and Uraraka believe the bomb was on a different floor than it actually was, while Bakugo stayed near the real one. He had explained this to Bakugo. Bakugo had told him to go to hell. Bakugo had then walked off down the corridor and disappeared into the maze of rooms with his hands smoking and his eyes alight. The buzzer rang. The exercise began. Izuku stood in the corridor on the bomb floor and waited. He had 3 seconds to register that something was happening upstairs before Bakugo came around the corner of his floor at a dead run. Bakugo had not gone after Ida and Uraraka. He had come down. He had come down to find Izuku. He was wearing the gauntlets. They were brand new equipment, on the recommendation of the support department. They held nitroglycerin sweat at high pressure and released it in a single concentrated detonation when the trigger was pulled. They were the most lethal piece of student equipment in the building. Bakugo had told the support department he intended to use them in practice, and the support department had assumed practice meant something other than first day of training trial. Bakugo skidded to a stop 10 feet from Izuku. He raised the right gauntlet. His hand on the trigger was already squeezing. Izuku saw his eyes. He saw the decision in them. He had a half second. Bakugo, don't. Bakugo fired. The detonation that came out of the gauntlet was the size of an artillery shell. The corridor lit up white. The pressure wave rolled out before the heat, which rolled out before the fire, which rolled out before the shrapnel of the gauntlet's release vent. It was an explosion meant to put a hole through a building wall. It hit Izuku at point-blank range. The phoenix had risen the instant it had felt the heat coming. The fire did not strike Izuku and burn him. The fire reached his skin and reversed direction. It drained into him. It poured into the open palm of his raised hand, into his arm, into his chest, like a river finding a faster channel. The pressure wave that should have flattened him collapsed inward in a tight halo around his body and was absorbed at his shoulders. The light that should have blinded him brightened instead behind his eyes where it joined the other golden lights that lived there. The fire was inside him. His feet had not moved. The corridor floor under his feet had melted into a small black puddle. The ceiling tiles a foot above his head curled outward as if blown by an invisible wind. His hair lifted. His green hair lifted slowly off his forehead in the current of his own aura, and it spread, and it moved in the air the way kelp moves in a slow tide. The temperature in the corridor climbed. The paint on the walls bubbled. Bakugo lowered the gauntlet. The smoke was still rolling out of the barrel. He was staring through the smoke, and his face had drained of all its color because what he had seen had not been an explosion striking a body. He had seen the explosion go into the body and disappear. Izuku opened his eyes. They were full of fire. His voice, when he spoke, came out doubled. His own teenage voice underneath, the layered chorus of the entity above, both saying the same words at once, in the same tone, with the same long-held grief at the back of them. "I'm not going to be your worthless punching bag, Deku, forever." He raised his hand. Bakugo flew backward. He did not get hit. He simply rose off the floor and traveled along an invisible track in the air toward the wall behind him, where he was pinned, pressed, held against the painted concrete by the weight of 1,000 pounds of focused telekinesis. His feet dangled, his chest worked, his gauntlets were still on his arms. Izuku extended 2 fingers, both gauntlets crushed. The sound was a single tight whine of metal. The reinforced steel, designed to contain detonations larger than the one Bakugo had just fired, folded inward as if it had been made of paper. The pressure tanks inside the gauntlets ruptured. Nitroglycerin sweat sprayed and ignited and was contained within the same telekinetic pinch that was already folding the metal, and so the secondary explosion did not blow Bakugo's arms off. It was absorbed back into the implosion of the gauntlets themselves. What was left when Izuku released his fingers was a pair of compact wads of slagged steel that fell off Bakugo's arms with 2 small thumps onto the corridor floor. Bakugo's hands were unburned. His arms were unburned. His face was bone white. The building was beginning to come apart. The phoenix was bleeding farther through. The corridor walls farther down the hall were warping inward, sagging in the heat. The ceiling above Izuku was beginning to drip. Actual molten concrete, falling in slow droplets that hardened back into stone the moment they passed out of his aura. The floor under his feet had spread into a glassy black pool, the diameter of a wading pool. The air in the building had begun to rotate around him, a slow spiral of superheated wind, the eye of a storm centered on a freckled boy with floating green hair. In the control booth, All Might was already moving. He had been watching the trial on the monitors, and he had seen the gauntlet fire, and he had been on his feet before the explosion finished. He hit the corridor wall outside the training building at full sprint, blew through it in a column of brick dust, and saw his students standing at the center of a melting building with eyes full of fire. He shouted Izuku's name. Izuku did not turn. All Might closed the distance in 3 strides. He wrapped his enormous arms around Izuku from behind, lifting the boy off the warped floor, pinning his arms to his sides. The Phoenix's aura splashed against All Might's chest like surf against a cliff, and All Might felt it, felt the actual weight of what he was holding back. The weight was wrong. The weight was the weight of something that could push him through the wall behind them without effort if it decided to. All Might had carried buildings. All Might had carried tankers. All Might had never carried something that felt like this. He held. "Young man," he said into Izuku's ear in his hero voice. "Young man, you are here. You are here in this corridor, with me, in this school on this earth. The boy on the wall is your classmate. He fired a stupid gauntlet because he is angry and afraid of you. He has been answered. You have answered him. Listen to me. Listen to my voice. Come back." The fire in Izuku's eyes flickered. "Come back," All Might said, and he meant it the way only somebody who had once stood at the edge of his own undoing could mean it. "Come back, son. Come back. There is so much I have to teach you. Please come back." The current in the air slowed, the wind in the corridor died, the ceiling stopped dripping, the floor began to harden, the fire in Izuku's eyes guttered down to its low simmer, and his hair settled out of its slow spread and fell back across his forehead, and the radio static in his head dimmed by a degree, and he sagged inside All Might's arms. Bakugo dropped off the wall and landed on his feet. He sat down on the floor immediately afterward. He could not seem to make his legs hold him. All Might lowered Izuku. He did not let go of his shoulders. Izuku looked at his hands. They were ordinary boy's hands. He looked at the corridor. The corridor was ruined. He looked at Bakugo. Bakugo was sitting on the floor against the far wall, staring at nothing, his mouth slightly open, the muscles in his jaw working in small, involuntary tics. "I'm sorry," Izuku said. His voice came out small. The doubling was gone. I'm sorry, I told him not to." "I know," All Might said. "I didn't want to do that. I know, son." Izuku looked at Bakugo again. Bakugo would not look up at him. The exercise ended. Ida and Uraraka were retrieved from the upper floors, where they had heard the explosion and run for the bomb room, and found the corridor leading to it half-melted and impassable. Bakugo was taken to the infirmary, where Recovery Girl looked him over and determined that he was physically unhurt, but suggested he sit somewhere for an hour and breathe. Izuku was taken to the infirmary too, in the other bed, where Recovery Girl looked him over and gave him a stern and unsurprised look and pressed a glass of water into his hand and told him to drink it. Izuku stared at the ceiling for a long time. He was not crying. He did not feel like crying. He felt very far away from his own body. He felt like he had been a passenger in his own head for 30 seconds, and the driver had been somebody he was afraid of. And the driver had only stopped because somebody else had reached through the window and grabbed the wheel. Kami texted him 11 minutes after the alarm went off. "You good?" He looked at the message. He typed back. No on it. His phone, in his hand, exhaled a small pink fog from the speaker. The fog moved up the air over his face and into his vision, and for a half second his bed was a beach, and the cathedral underwater stopped, and he closed his eyes and breathed inside the half second the way a swimmer breathes between waves. When he opened them again, the infirmary was back, and he was still trembling, and he was still horrified, and he was still in his own skin, and that was enough to get through the next breath. He texted her back. "Thank you. I love you." He did not realize what he had typed until he had typed it. He stared at the message. He thought about deleting it. He thought about it for a long second. He did not delete it. The reply came back almost immediately. "Love you too, fam. Coming over after school. Don't disappear on me." He let his hand fall to the bed. Across the infirmary, behind a privacy curtain, he could hear Bakugo breathing. The breathing was uneven. He thought about saying something. He thought about apologizing again. He decided not to. He had decided in middle school that there were certain things he could not fix by talking, and that Bakugo's relationship to his own pride was at the top of the list. He would let him have the silence. He would let him keep that much. The next day, Bakugo came into class 15 minutes late and sat down without looking at anybody. He did not look at Izuku. He did not look at Izuku for 3 weeks. When he eventually did look at Izuku again, the look was different. It was not friendlier. It was something harder than friendliness. It was the look of a man who had decided to climb a mountain he could see now had a top, and who was angry that the top was higher than he had thought, and who was in some deep buried place going to climb anyway. Izuku saw the look. He did not comment on it. He let it be. Some rivalries are nobody's to resolve except the rivals themselves. The USJ attack happened on a Wednesday. Kami was visiting that day because the joint exchange program had her shadowing Class 1A for a week as part of an inter-academy curriculum experiment. She had been allowed into the field trip by special permission. She rode in the bus next to Izuku. She made every member of Class 1A laugh inside of 10 minutes. She told Asui that her costume was iconic, the silhouette 10 out of 10, slay, and Asui blinked at her placidly and said, "Thank you, Utsushimi-san. I appreciate that very much," and they were friends from that point onward. Izuku sat by the window. He held Kami's hand in his lap. He was watching the road. He was watching the road because his head had been quieter than usual for 2 days, and he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. The radio static was always loudest, right before something bad happened. The static was suspiciously low. The static lit up the moment the bus pulled into the USJ parking lot. He sat up straighter. Kami noticed instantly. Her thumb moved against his. What? Something. Something how? Something somebody. She did not ask further. She set her hat back on her head and said, "Cool, cool, cool, cool." Cool, in the way she always said it when she was getting ready to do work, and they got off the bus together. The USJ was the indoor disaster simulation facility. 13, the Rescue Pro, was waiting at the entrance to lecture them. Aizawa was beside him, looking, as always, like he had not slept in 2 weeks. The class filed in. Izuku scanned the central plaza. The static in his head climbed. He saw in the corner of his vision a faint shimmer in the air near the central fountain, the kind of shimmer that bad air made over hot pavement, except the pavement was cool, and there was no source for the heat. The shimmer opened. A man stepped through it. Pale gray hair, dry red eyes, hands covering his face, hands covering his shoulders, hands covering his arms. Behind him came a figure of liquid black mist with 2 metal plates for eyes. Behind the 2 of them came 40-odd lower villains, pouring out of the rift into the plaza of the USJ in a black wave. Aizawa was already moving. His scarf was unwinding from his neck. His goggles dropped over his eyes. He was a blur of dark fabric heading down the steps toward the wave. The mist figure spread. The black mist rolled outward, expanded, swallowed the plaza. Izuku felt it reach for him. He felt himself begin to be pulled, felt the mist's intent, which was to scatter the students to break the herd. He grabbed Cammy's hand harder. He concentrated. His telekinesis flared as a small dense field around the 2 of them, and the mist could not get its grip, and they were swept out of the plaza together as a single unit, and the world rolled and lurched, and they landed on cracked stone in the ruin zone with Tokoyami beside them. Tokoyami had landed on his feet. Dark Shadow was already out, hovering at his shoulder in a low alert posture. The familiar saw Izuku and made a small unhappy sound that was almost a hiss. Tokoyami patted the familiar's beak, said something low to it, and turned to Izuku with a small bow. Midoriya. Utsushimi-san. It seems we are in the same zone. How many? Izuku said. He was already moving forward, into the open ground at the center of the ruins. I count 11 within visible range, Tokoyami said. They are advancing on our position. Kami was already exhaling. The pink fog rolled out of her mouth in a thick curl, spread and divided into multiple curls. Okay, fam, giving them a little disorientation surprise. Burb. The fog reached the villains. They began to run in different directions, shouting at things that were not there. One of them shot a stream of acid at empty air. Another swung an axe at a tree that did not exist. They scattered like dropped marbles. Tokoyami nodded. Excellent. Take the left flank, Izuku said. He was watching the right. There were 3 villains on the right who had clearly trained against illusionists before. They were holding their hands over their ears, eyes shut, advancing toward the source of the smell of the smoke. I'll handle the right. Kami, stay behind me. Behind you, yes. Hi. Absolutely. Yes, Kami said. Already there, fam. He walked forward. He did not run. He walked. The phoenix wanted to run. He held it at the lid. He had been practicing this for a month, using his telekinesis at full ability while keeping the entity at the bottom of his throat. It was the work of a piano teacher pressing keys with one hand while keeping the other hand still on the bench. It was harder than anything he had ever done. The 3 villains broke through the smoke. They saw him. They charged. He raised his hand. The first villain came at him with a shoulder lowered, quirk active. His body had a quirk that made his skin like steel, and Izuku reached out with 2 fingers and pinched. The villain's center of mass redirected itself. He hit the ground face first and slid. He stayed there. He was breathing. He would be breathing for a while. The second villain had a quirk that made his hands rotate at high speed. He came in swinging a buzzsaw arm. Izuku tilted his head, lifted his palm, and pushed. The villain stopped existing in the air for a half second, telekinetically held, his arms still rotating uselessly, and Izuku let him drop, gently, 3 feet to the left, where he landed on his back and discovered he could not move because the weight on his chest had not actually lifted off him. The third villain had a gun. Izuku raised an eyebrow. He pinched. The gun's barrel folded inward, the firing pin sheared off, and the magazine sprang loose from the grip in 3 separate directions. The villain stared at the ruined gun. He looked up at Izuku. He turned and ran. Izuku let him run. Running was an excellent decision on the villain's part. Running was the best decision the villain had made all morning. Behind him, Tokoyami's familiar was already at work in the smoke, pulling villains out of Kami's illusions and slamming them into walls. Kami herself was perched on a low piece of broken stone, her hat tipped back, her eyes squinted in concentration, exhaling fresh fog every few seconds. She was humming. She always hummed when she was working. Izuku turned to walk back to her. He had cleared the right flank, and he wanted to be next to her before whatever was coming next came. When the air over the ruin zone rippled, black mist opened above them. A shape fell out of the mist. It was very large. It was very black. Its skin was patchworked together in seams, and its skull had been opened and refilled, and its eyes were small and white and stupid, and its arms were the length of a city bus. The Nomu landed on the cracked stone of the ruin zone with a thud that put a starburst crack through the stone. Its eyes locked onto Kami, its head tilted. Shigaraki's voice came from the mist above. "Kill the girl." The Nomu lunged. The lid blew off. Izuku felt it go. He felt the lid he had been holding down for 5 years buckle, lift, and tear free, and the thing underneath rose up his throat and through his shoulders and out the top of his head, and the phoenix unfurled inside him without resistance, and there was no time. There was only fire, and the fire was loud, and the fire was full of a single thought, and the single thought was not her. The psychic scream that came out of his mind was heard by every human inside the USJ. It was not a sound. It was a telepathic impact. It struck Aizawa 50 meters away and put him on one knee. It struck 13, who was being attacked at the entrance, and made the pro freeze in mid-defense. It struck every villain still standing in the plaza, and all of them clutched their heads, because the scream they had heard inside their skulls was a single high note of pure terror that had been directed not at them but past them, and the past them direction was the direction of something that did not regard them as worth screaming at. It struck Shigaraki in the central plaza, and the man took one staggered step backward and reached up to his face and felt, for the first time in his life, the chemistry of fear in his own blood. Izuku rose into the air. He rose without using his legs. His feet were a meter off the cracked stone. His green hair lifted again, but this time it lifted higher into a corona around his head, and his eyes were not gold. They were white gold, the color of the heart of a star, the color of a thing that should not have a color name in any human language. The aura around him spread outward into the firebird shape, but the firebird this time was the size of the entire ruin zone. It overshadowed everything. It was as wide as the artificial sky. The Nomu was already in mid-lunge toward Kami. Izuku moved. He covered the 20 meters between himself and the Nomu in a fraction of a second. He intercepted the lunge with his body. His hand came up, flat-palmed, and pressed against the Nomu's chest. He did not punch. He did not throw it. He just placed his palm on the thick, leathery skin over its sternum. The Phoenix Force broke the Nomu down at the atomic level. It started where his palm touched. The Nomu's flesh under his hand did not burn. It unmade. The atoms holding its molecules together released their bonds. The molecules drifted apart into their constituent parts. The constituent parts ceased to be matter and became light, and the light fed back into the firebird above, and the unmade region spread outward from his palm in a ring at the speed of a thrown stone. The Nomu's hyper-regeneration tried to keep up. It tried for a full second. The cells at the edges of the unmade region attempted to reproduce, found the materials they were trying to reproduce out of had ceased to be materials, and gave up. The unmaking ran up the chest, into the shoulders, out along the arms, up the neck, into the skull. The Nomu opened its mouth as if to roar. It did not get the chance. It was dust, drifting, silent dust, where a creature had been a second ago. The dust settled to the stone in a gray ring around Izuku's feet. He lowered his hand. He turned. He looked at the plaza. Aizawa was on his knees. Aizawa was looking up. Aizawa had erasure goggles on, and the goggles were doing nothing, because erasure worked on quirks, and the thing inside Izuku Midoriya was a great deal more than a quirk. Aizawa lowered the goggles. He stood up slowly. He did not run toward the situation. He did not move at all. He understood with the sharp instinct of a man who had survived a long career in this line of work by knowing when to step out of the way that the situation no longer required him. Izuku walked. He did not run. He walked toward the plaza. The cracked stone under his feet flattened. His feet were a half-inch off the ground. He covered the distance to the central plaza in a slow, deliberate float that gave Shigaraki and Kurogiri several seconds to look at him. Shigaraki looked. He had been the second in command of the League of Villains. He had stood across rooms from pro heroes and laughed at them. He had stood across rooms from his master, the man behind the curtain, and had survived. He had not been afraid of any human being in his entire adult life. He was afraid now. His hands were shaking inside their hand coverings. The hand on his face was vibrating against his skin. He spoke to Kurogiri without turning his head. "Open it," he said. "Open it now." Kurogiri did not need a second instruction. The mist behind Shigaraki spread, formed a doorway, began to anchor itself into the air. Izuku reached the edge of the plaza. He looked at Kurogiri. Kurogiri was a mist with two pieces of metal in it. To anybody else, that was what Kurogiri was. To Izuku, Kurogiri was a great deal more. Izuku's telekinesis had been growing finer for months under his control. It could feel the molecular lattice of pine needles. It could feel, when extended toward Kurogiri, the architecture of what had been built. He felt the Nomu construct that made up the warping mist. He felt, underneath the construct, a faint signal, a human consciousness, fragmented, suppressed, layered under the warping field like a song under static. He felt the original mind. He felt the boy who had once been a UA student. He felt the name that was buried under the body. Oboro, he did something the Phoenix had been preparing him to do for a long time. He reached into Kurogiri with his telekinesis and separated. He held the human consciousness still. He gathered the original mind into a single point and held it, gently, like a moth in cupped hands, in his own awareness. Then he ran his palm down the warping construct that the Nomu architects had built around the man, and the construct came apart at its seams. The atomic lattice of the Nomu structure released. The warp field collapsed. The mist that had been Kurogiri unraveled into ordinary air and was gone. The portal it had been building dissolved with it. The fragment of human consciousness sat suspended in Izuku's mind, terrified, partial, awake for the first time in years. Izuku spoke to it without moving his mouth. He sent the thought directly. "You're safe. You're Oboro. I'm holding you. Stay still. I'm going to bring your old friend to you. Stay with me." The fragment did not answer in words. It sent back a feeling. The feeling was relief. Izuku turned to Shigaraki. Shigaraki was alone. The mist behind him had vanished. The portal was gone. The Nomu lay as dust in the ruin zone. The villains in the plaza had either been bound by Aizawa or were running blind in Kami's residual smoke. Shigaraki was alone, and he was facing a 15-year-old boy hovering an inch off the ground with eyes the color of a star's heart. He turned to run. There was nowhere to run. He ran anyway. He ran for the entrance of the USJ. He made it 10 meters. The air around him caught. Izuku held him. Izuku did not throw him. He held him. He held Shigaraki in place inside a sphere of telekinesis, the size of his body, his feet kicking, his hands clawing at the air. He floated him backward and turned him to face the boy who had killed his Nomu. Izuku looked at him. He felt the Phoenix's pull. The pull was not a thought. The pull was a hunger. The pull wanted to burn. The pull wanted to ash the man as it had ashed the Nomu. The pull was, also, the part of Izuku that had seen Shigaraki order a Nomu to kill Kami. The pull was the part of Izuku that had felt his lid blow off because Shigaraki had pointed his weapon at the only silence in his life. The pull and the boy were aligned, on this matter in a way they almost never were. Izuku spoke. His voice was layered. "You shouldn't have come here." Shigaraki's mouth worked. He tried to speak. The word that came out was something like, "Please." Izuku's eyes did not change. He raised his hand. The Phoenix Force took Shigaraki apart the way it had taken the Nomu apart. It was the same process. It was the unmaking of matter into its constituent parts. The release of atomic bonds, the gentle drift downward of what had been a man. There was no scream. The scream would have required vocal cords, and the vocal cords were among the first things that became dust. There was, briefly, a pile of clothing and a single severed hand, the one Shigaraki had worn on his face. The hand fell separately and lay on the stone of the plaza, fingers curled, the only piece of the man that remained. Izuku looked at it. He did not feel pride. He did not feel satisfaction. He did not feel anything. Something inside him, very far back, registered that he had now killed a person, and the registration was a small, bright object he placed inside a box he would have to open later. He turned his head. He turned away from the plaza. He looked back at the ruin zone. Kami was already running toward him. She was running fast. She did not slow down. She did not look at the dust. She crashed into him with both arms, wrapped them around his back and pressed her face into his shoulder. And he stood with his arms at his sides and let her hold him. And after a second, he raised his arms and held her back. And the phoenix folded its wings down to the inside of his chest. And his feet settled the inch back to the stone. And the white gold light in his eyes dimmed to ordinary gold and then to ordinary green. And he was Izuku Midoriya again, 15 years old. And Kami was crying into his uniform and saying, "You scared me, fam. You scared me. You scared me," in a voice that was small and trembling, and absolutely unafraid of him. He held her. Aizawa walked up. The captured villains had been bound. The other students had begun to filter in from their zones, alive, mostly unhurt. All Might had arrived at the entrance of the USJ in his hero form, having come at a sprint from the school, and he had stopped just inside the door because he had seen the dust pile, and he had understood what had happened without anybody needing to explain. Aizawa stopped a meter away from Izuku. He looked at the pile of dust. He looked at the severed hand. He looked at the boy holding the girl. He sighed in a way that contained an entire career. "Midoriya. Sir, there is a piece of a person I need to give back. Inside my head." Aizawa paused. He looked at him. He looked at him longer. "Whose person?" "His name is Oboro. He was a student at UA a long time ago. He went missing. Something used his body to make a Nomu. The Nomu is gone. He is still here." Aizawa's face did not change. His face never changed. It was a face that had been trained over 20 years to never change, especially under conditions that would make any other face change. The face did not change. The eyes, however, did. The eyes went still. The eyes went very still. Then the eyes wet, in a way that they had not been allowed to wet in years, and Aizawa pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, and he breathed out once, and he said, in a voice that was held together by every thread he had, "Bring him." Izuku reached inside himself. He reached for the moth. He cupped it in his telekinetic hands. He extended outward, gently into Aizawa's mind, and the fragment crossed from one to the other, and Aizawa's eyes went wider, and then they closed, and he stood very still, and Izuku watched a man he barely knew receive a friend the man had been mourning for 15 years. Aizawa whispered something into the air. The whisper was a name. The name was Oboro. Izuku stepped back. He did not interrupt. He turned away to give the man his moment, and he walked back to Kami, who was still holding him. He looked over her shoulder. He looked at his classmates beginning to gather at the entrance. He looked at All Might in the doorway with his blue eyes wet. He did not feel triumphant. He felt afraid. He had killed a man. He had ashed him. He had done it without joy and without hesitation and without thinking about it afterward. And the simplicity of how easy it had been to do was the most frightening thing about the whole afternoon. The Nomu had taken effort. Shigaraki had taken less than a second. Shigaraki had been a person, and a person had been dust before Izuku's hand had finished rising. He pressed his face into Kami's hair. She did not let him go. She did not let go of him for an hour. The press picked up the USJ attack within 24 hours. The press did not get the full story. The press got the story UA was willing to release, which was Class 1A was attacked at an off-site training facility by an organized villain group. The group has been neutralized. All students are unharmed. The leadership of the group has been ended by an unspecified intervention. The press did not get a name. The press understood that there was a name that was being kept. The press began to dig. The press would dig for the rest of the year. They would find pieces. They would never find the whole picture. They would eventually settle on a working theory that there was a single student at UA of significantly higher capability than the rest, and the theory would crystallize around the boy with green hair who had appeared in entrance exam footage that one news network had managed to obtain. The footage showed only a beam of golden light and a clearing of clouds. The footage was enough. By the time the sports festival arrived a month later, the press had a name. By the time the sports festival arrived, every household in Japan knew that Midoriya, Izuku, was a student at UA. He had been receiving fan mail. He had been receiving fan mail in the volume that pro heroes received fan mail. He had been receiving hate mail, too, the kind that came with neat handwriting and a return address listed as concerned citizen. He had read several. He had stopped after that. Inko had taken over reading the mail. She had thrown most of it away. The fan mail she had saved in a box under her bed because her son had stopped reading any of it, and she could not bear for it to be gone entirely. He walked into the stadium on the morning of the sports festival with his hands in his pockets and his head down, and the crowd of 40,000 people noticed him and went still. The way a forest goes still when something larger than the largest animal in it walks through. He did not look up. He did not wave. He stood in the line with his class. He let Ida read the contestant's oath. He waited his turn. He moved through the obstacle race with the smallest amount of telekinesis he could justify. He cleared the robot obstacles by floating around them. He won because he had elected to float, and the floating put him over the heads of every other runner, and Aizawa had told him before the festival, "Midoriya, please remember that holding back is a different skill from disappearing. Compete. Win." He had taken Aizawa's advice. He had finished a comfortable first. He moved through the cavalry battle by holding a low telekinetic platform under his own teammates' feet and gliding around the field. He took his classmates' point bands by lifting them off their headbands without ever passing within arm's reach of them. He won that round too. He arrived at the one-on-one bracket as the heavy favorite. He was paired into the upper half. He moved through his early rounds by floating his opponents over the boundary line one at a time. He had stopped trying to make it look like a sport by the third match. He was simply finishing. Then the bracket placed him opposite Shoto Todoroki. He had watched Todoroki from a distance for the entire school year. Todoroki was a yearmate. Todoroki had a quirk that had been engineered by his father to be one of the most powerful in the country. Half cold, half fire. Todoroki used the cold and refused the fire. The cold had taken him to the semifinals. The cold would not be enough against him. Todoroki had been watching Izuku for the entire school year, too. He had been waiting for this match. They stood across the arena from each other in the stadium air. The crowd was so loud, it was a single noise, indistinguishable in its individual parts. The commentary booth was talking over the noise. Present Mike was screaming. Aizawa in the booth was telling him to shut up. The starting bell rang. Todoroki did not say anything. He raised his right foot. He stamped it down. A wave of ice spread outward from the boy at the speed of an avalanche. It crossed the arena floor in a single rolling sheet, climbing into a wave at the leading edge, 20 feet tall, full of jagged crystal spikes. It came at Izuku as fast as a moving truck. Izuku rose into the air. He hovered above the arena, 10 meters up, his shoes loose on his feet. The wave of ice reached the boundary of his aura, and the ice in a 20-foot radius below him melted into clean water and ran down off the arena floor in a wide sheet. The melt happened without sound. The water steamed and was gone. Izuku watched Todoroki across the air. He spoke. He pitched his voice to carry over the crowd. "Hey." Todoroki looked up. You're holding half of yourself in your own pocket. I can feel it from here. It's making you slower." Todoroki's face did not move. "I'm not going to win this for you," Izuku said. "I'm going to win this, but I'm asking. Just once. Are you going to fight me with all of it, or are you going to make me push you out of bounds while you keep pretending you're only made of one half?" Todoroki spoke for the first time. His voice was sharp. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I can feel it. I can feel the heat in your left side. It wants out. You're keeping it in because of what your father did to you. I am not asking you to use it for him. I am asking you to use it for you. It's yours. He doesn't own it. He never did." The arena had quieted. The cameras had picked the conversation up. 40,000 people in the stadium and millions of people at home had heard the boy in the air say the words, and 40,000 people in the stadium and millions of people at home now had a private opinion about Endeavor and his son. Todoroki's face cracked. It cracked in the way faces crack when a person has held something for years and the holding has just been named out loud by a stranger. He took a step backward. His right hand flexed. The frost on the arena floor surged again, and Izuku melted it again, and the air between them filled with steam. "You don't get to tell me what to do," Todoroki said. "I'm not telling you what to do. You are. I'm telling you what's true. It's mine to use or not. Then use it or don't." But you came to win the sports festival, and you're going to lose to me holding half of yourself off. I'd rather you lose to me with all of yourself on. You'd rather it too. I can feel that. From here. I can feel everything from here, Todoroki. I'm sorry. The boy across the arena clenched his teeth. The fight resumed without a bell. Todoroki sent a second wave of ice. Izuku melted it. The third came. He melted it. The fourth came, larger, more committed, more desperate, the entire arena floor lifting into spike fields that Izuku descended through unhurt. He came down to the arena floor. He landed 30 feet from Todoroki. He stood. He waited. He waited for the boy to choose. The crowd held its breath. Todoroki raised his left hand caught fire. It was a small fire at first. It guttered along his fingers as if uncertain. He looked at it like it was somebody else's hand. He flexed the fingers. The fire grew. It ran up his arm. It spread across his shoulder. It blazed up into a halo around his head and ate the frost off his scalp and the ice off his right side. And the boy, who had been half white and half red, became a whole shape on the arena floor, a single figure burning in two different temperatures, and he turned his eyes to Izuku, and the eyes were full of something they had not been full of before. Fine. Izuku smiled. It was a small, real smile. It was the smile of a person who had been hoping for an outcome and had received it. The phoenix smiled with him. The two smiles overlapped. The smile that came out of his face was the doubled one, his own teenage warmth underneath, the entity's gladness above, both glad about the same thing. He lifted his arms, his aura unfolded behind him into the firebird shape. The shape was as large as the arena. The wings spread wide enough to overshadow the entire crowd. The heat of it warmed the stands. The cameras spinning around the arena tracked Izuku and the Firebird simultaneously. The commentary booth had gone silent. Present Meek had stopped speaking. Aizawa was leaning forward in his chair with his hand cupped against his mouth. "It's yours!" Izuku shouted across the arena. His voice doubled on the last word, the entity bleeding through under his own. "Your quirk, not his." Todoroki ignited. He came at Izuku in a burst of fire and ice, the two halves working together for the first time in his life. The fire boiled out from his left side in a wave wider than his body. The ice came from his right in a curving wall meant to herd Izuku into the fire. The combination was the kind of thing a person practices for 10 years. The combination had never been practiced for a single day. It was happening for the first time, on instinct, in front of a stadium full of people. It was the most beautiful fight any of them had ever seen. Izuku met it. He met the fire with his bare hands. He caught it the way a person catches water. The biological combustion of Todoroki's flames was hot, but it was ordinary heat. Molecules, chemistry, oxygen. Izuku's aura ate it. The fire passed into his palms, and his palms did not burn because to the thing inside him, biological fire was a warm towel. He shaped the fire. He held it in front of him in a small turning sphere, the way a child might hold a snowball, and the sphere turned a different color in his hands, moved from the orange-red of combustion into the gold-white of something more. And he flicked it back across the arena. He gave the fire back to Todoroki. The fire was Todoroki's, the way a man gives back a borrowed coat. The coat had been worn. The coat had been seen. The coat returned in the same shape with one piece of the inner lining stitched cleaner than it had been. Todoroki caught it on his open palm. He felt his own fire come back into him at a different temperature. He felt the way his own flame had been reorganized. He looked at his hand. He looked up. He had not known his fire could feel like this. Izuku descended a step. He raised his hand. He pushed. It was a single telekinetic shove. It was not heavy. It was, by his standards, almost gentle. It lifted Todoroki off his feet and carried him backward in a straight line out of the arena, over the white boundary line, and set him down on the dirt outside, still on his feet, still burning on one side, still full of his own newly reorganized fire. The bell rang. Izuku Midoriya had won. He landed. The Firebird folded back into him. He stood on the arena floor, then he fell to one knee. Blood came out of his nose. It was a fast, fat drop. The drop was followed by another, then by several. He pressed the back of his hand to his face. The arena went silent in the way arenas go silent when 40,000 people have just realized the boy in the middle is bleeding. The Phoenix had cost something. It had cost a great deal. He had held it caged through 3 rounds and then let it out for 30 seconds, and the cost of letting it out and then putting it back was a price his body would have to pay over the next several days. Recovery Girl came onto the arena floor at a brisk pace. So did Kami. Kami had been in the stands. She had been in the stands the whole time, screaming at every match. She vaulted the rail. She crossed the dirt to him at a run. She got to him before Recovery Girl did. She knelt beside him. She pressed a tissue to his nose without asking. She told him in a small, fierce voice that he was the most reckless boy in Japan and that she was going to feed him soup for a week. He laughed through the blood. The laugh was thin, but it was a laugh. Todoroki walked back into the arena. He was no longer burning. He stood 10 feet away. He did not speak. He bowed once, low, formal, the bow of a young man who has been given something he could not have given himself, and Izuku raised one hand from the dirt to acknowledge it, and that was all that was said between them on that arena floor. The crowd erupted. The next morning's news was a single story in every paper. The story was not about who won. The story was about a boy who had caught fire in his hands and given it back to its owner in a different shape. Endeavor watched the footage in his living room. He watched it 3 times. He did not speak. His face did the smallest thing. He left the room. That story is for another day. Izuku was given the gold medal. He stood on the podium. Kami was in the front row. His mother was in the front row beside her. He saw both of their faces. He smiled. He did not cry. He had cried enough that year. He let the medal be put around his neck. He let the cameras flash. He bowed. He went home. He slept for 16 hours. When he woke up, his phone had 340 messages on it. He read 4. He set it back down. He went into the kitchen. He sat at the table. Kami had stayed over because his mother had decided that Kami was allowed to stay over after sports festivals at which her boyfriend had bled from his face. Kami was sitting across from him in a stolen UA hoodie. She was eating a bowl of cereal. She looked up. "Hey," she said. "Hey, you good?" "I think so." "You're going to be more good once you eat something." She slid a plate across the table. It had eggs on it. The eggs were perfect. He picked up his fork. He ate. He looked at her. He thought about her. He thought with a feeling he was not used to feeling, that he loved her in a way that was now obviously and completely permanent, and that the way had been building since the seminar, and that the building was over now, and that the new shape of the love was something he was going to have to learn to carry the way he had learned to carry the other large thing. He did not say it. He did not need to. She knew. She had known for a while. She smiled at him over the cereal. The internship offers came in the next week. Every agency in Japan offered. Every agency. Even the agencies that had nothing to do with his probable hero specialty. Endeavor's agency offered. Hawks' agency offered. Best Genist's agency offered. Mount Lady's agency offered, which surprised everyone, including Mount Lady's manager. The volume of offers was so high that the school had to set up a separate intake table. He chose Gran Torino. Aizawa had recommended him. Aizawa had said in the small private meeting Izuku had been called into, "Midoriya, I want you to train with somebody who is going to focus on the wrong thing on purpose. You don't need someone who's going to drill your power. Your power is fine. You need someone who's going to drill your peace. Gran Torino is old, fast, mean, and right. Go to him." Izuku had gone to him. Gran Torino's apartment was a small place in a quiet neighborhood in Tokyo, full of leftover takeout cartons and dusty books. The old man had opened the door, looked at Izuku for 10 seconds without speaking, and then said, "You're the one who unmade a building." "Yes, sir. You're early. Come in." The training started that afternoon. It was not what Izuku had expected. There were no power drills. There were no combat scenarios. There were a great many breathing exercises, a great many long walks, and a great many conversations on the small porch in the late afternoon while the old man drank tea and Izuku watched the sunlight move across the wood. Gran Torino was blunt. He was direct. He had been a hero longer than anybody alive, and he had buried more friends than any one man should have to bury. And he had learned in the burying that the strongest people on Earth lived or died based on what they did inside their own heads. He sat across from Izuku on the porch one evening and pointed at him with a teaspoon. "You think it's a monster?" "Yes, sir." "It isn't. It's a part of you. The part of you that wants to burn. Everybody has a part of them that wants to burn. Most people's part is the size of a candle. Yours is the size of a sun. You don't fight it. You learn to live next to it. You give it space. You speak to it. You feed it small things so it doesn't get hungry for big things. You sleep next to it the way you sleep next to a tiger you raised from a cub. The tiger isn't going to eat you because the tiger knows you. You think the tiger is going to eat you because you keep looking at the tiger out of the corner of your eye instead of looking it in the face. Izuku stared at the teaspoon. How do I look it in the face? You meditate. You breathe. You stop being afraid of it. The fear is what feeds it. Fear is the worst possible food for a thing like that. Joy is good. Grief is bad. Anger is the worst. Love is the best. If you love something, the firebird loves it too. If you love your girl, that thing inside you loves her. It will fight for her. It has fought for her already. You felt the difference, didn't you, when you took the Nomu apart? Izuku swallowed. Yes, sir. Of course you did. It was your fire, but it wanted what you wanted. That's the trick. The two of you want the same things. You think it's a passenger. It thinks you are the passenger. Neither of you is right. You are the same animal in two clothes. Learn to wear both. He drank his tea. He looked at the sunset. He spoke again without looking at Izuku. You're going to do a thing soon, kid. I don't know what. I know it's coming. You're going to almost lose it. I want you to remember something when that happens. The girl with the smoke. She is your anchor. She is a real anchor. She will hold you if you let her. You let her. Do you hear me? You let her hold you. The day you start thinking you don't deserve to be held is the day the thing inside you wins. Don't have that day. Izuku looked at him. Yes, sir, he said. Gran Torino nodded once. They did not speak for the rest of the sunset. 3 days later, Izuku traveled to Hosu City to assist with patrols. The League of Villains had reorganized after the USJ, under leadership Izuku had not yet identified, and a series of attacks on Hosu had been escalating throughout the week. Ida was also in Hosu on his own internship with Manuel. They had agreed to meet for dinner. Izuku was looking forward to it. He liked Ida, he never made dinner. The first sign was the radio static. It climbed in his head as he walked along the 3rd Avenue toward the meeting spot. He felt it pull west. He stopped walking. He listened. He had been training with Gran Torino to listen to the static instead of fight it, and the static had begun to give him useful information when he listened. The static was telling him there was a person about to die 3 blocks west of him. He moved. He reached the alley in seconds. He arrived as Stain raised his sword above Ida. Stain was a small man. He was painted in red. He had teeth. He had the practiced posture of a man who had hunted heroes for a long time. His sword was about to come down on Ida's neck. Ida was on his back, conscious, bleeding from a gash on his arm, his leg useless. The man Stain had been hunting first, a pro hero named Native, was bound to a wall by leather strapping. Izuku appeared at the mouth of the alley. He did not announce himself. He raised one finger. Stain's sword stopped a foot above Ida's neck. Izuku held it there in the air. He looked at the man holding the hilt. Step back, Izuku said. His voice was level. The phoenix had not yet stirred because his fear had not yet spiked, because Ida was alive. Drop the sword. Stain looked up at him. Stain had a quirk that paralyzed people who he tasted the blood of. The quirk required contact, and the contact required the blood. He had never met a pro he could not eventually paralyze. He met Izuku's eyes, and what he saw there made him understand in some fast back room of his head that he was not going to taste this boy's blood. He took a step backward. He did not drop the sword. The night sky tore open. 6 winged Nomus came down out of the dark. They had been launched on a timed release by the League leadership Izuku had not yet identified. They were heavier than the Nomu from the USJ. They had wings the span of a small plane each. They came down on Hosu City in a loose pattern designed to attack 3 districts at once. Izuku felt them as they came. He felt them not the way a person feels approaching enemies. He felt them the way a god feels its prey. The phoenix inside him lifted its head, and this time it lifted high. And this time it did not stop lifting. He looked at Ida. He looked at Native. He looked at Stain. He looked at the sky. He left the ground. He did not fly up like a person who had remembered to use a quirk. He left the ground the way a launched rocket leaves a launch pad, with a punch of telekinetic pressure that flattened the alley pavement and threw debris in every direction. He cleared the alley walls in a second. He cleared the rooftops in 2. He was at 300 meters over Hosu City in 5, and at 500 meters in 10, and at the height of a low cloud layer in 15. The Firebird unfolded around him. It unfolded at scale. The wingspan of it was a mile across. The body of it was the height of a 30-story building. The feathers of it, when the cameras of the news helicopters caught them in the night sky over Hosu, were each as long as a city block. The light coming off it was bright enough to wake every dog within 100 kilometers. The heat coming off it was enough to dry the surface of the river that ran through the city. People on rooftops in Hosu looked up. People on rooftops in Tokyo, 80 kilometers north, looked up. People on rooftops in Yokohama looked up. The sky over a large part of central Japan was suddenly full of a gold so bright it cast shadows. Izuku looked at the winged Nomus. He raised his hand. The first Nomu went up in a single beam of gold light from above. The beam came down through the creature's wing, traveled down its body, and unmade its molecular structure. The Nomu fell out of the air as a cloud of drifting dust. The second Nomu was 300 meters away. He turned his palm a degree to the right, and a second beam came down. The second Nomu was dust before it had finished beating its next wing stroke. The third was already turning to escape. He turned with it. The beam followed the curve of the Nomu's flight path. The Nomu died mid-bank. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth. 6 beams. 6 clouds of drifting dust. The winged Nomu attack on Hosu City was over in 11 seconds. The buildings under Izuku began to crack. The cracks came from his own gravity. He had ascended too high inside his own aura. The pull of his presence had begun to warp the air. The pressure differential beneath him was actively bending the air column down to his location, and the bending was pulling on every structure for blocks. Window glass in office buildings 6 blocks out shattered into the streets. Streetlights leaned. Asphalt cracked in concentric rings. He could feel it. He could feel all of it. He could feel the air molecules moving. He could feel the pigeons on every roof in the city losing their grip on the tiles. He could feel the heartbeats of every person in every apartment in every direction. He could feel, when he extended his awareness, the entire city as a single throbbing organism beneath him. He could destroy it. He could feel that, too. He could feel exactly how he would do it. The arithmetic was already done in some back room of his head. The way the arithmetic for the Nomu had been already done, the way the arithmetic for Shigaraki had been already done. The arithmetic existed. The arithmetic was simple. The arithmetic said, here are 800,000 atomic lattices. Here is the input required to release them. Here is the output. The Phoenix watched the arithmetic. The Phoenix said in a voice that was inside him, yes, do it. Burn it. Let me out. Let me out the rest of the way. Let me out at last. He felt himself slipping. He felt the part of himself that loved Kami and his mother, and Ida bleeding in the alley below, and the kindness of Gran Torino on the porch, and the dignity of Aizawa receiving a fragment of a friend, and the bow Todoroki had given him. He felt all those parts of himself begin to thin out into a single bright line, and the rest of him begin to be filled with something older, hungrier, more honest, more itself. His eyes were full of white gold. His mouth was open. He had begun, without realizing it, to descend toward the city. The Firebird was tilting its head downward. The mile-wide wings were beginning to angle. The aura was beginning to focus into a column that would fall on the city center like a sword. From an alley below, Stain looked up. The hero killer, who had spent years hunting men he considered unworthy, who had stood over the broken bodies of dozens of pros, who had never flinched in his life, dropped his sword. The sword hit the asphalt and bounced. He fell to his knees. He had set out to expose the corruption of the powerful. He had built an entire ideology on the conviction that strength always rotted those who held it. He had looked up at the boy in the sky, and what he had seen was a thing that should have rotted, that should have been corrupt by every law of his ideology, that should have been the worst example of his thesis, and was instead a boy who was losing. A boy who was fighting to hold something so large that the holding alone was a heroism Stain had no framework for. Stain stared up. His mouth worked. "What?" he whispered. "The hell are you?" The phoenix tilted further. Izuku's mouth opened wider. A sound began to come out of him. The sound was the beginning of a note that would have ended the city. The pink smoke hit him. It came at him from across the rooftops, a cloud that traveled too fast for ordinary air, propelled by a quirk that was very specifically built to push illusions across distance. Kami was on top of a building 2 blocks south. She had been picking up emergency alerts on her phone, and she had been at her Shiketsu dorm watching the breaking news, and she had seen the gold light over Hosu in the sky outside her window, and she had grabbed her hat and run. She had run 4 kilometers across the rooftops in her uniform with her mentor lagging 2 roofs behind her, and she had reached the closest building to him, and she had inhaled, and she had pushed her glamour with everything she had. The smoke reached him. The smoke went up his nose and into his lungs and into the back of his head. The glamour was not a beach. The glamour was his kitchen. He was standing in his kitchen. The afternoon light was coming through the curtain over the sink. The window was open. Inko was at the counter. She was wearing the apron with the little embroidered fox on it that she had had since he was small. She was stirring a pot. She turned. She saw him in the doorway. She smiled. She said, "Sweetheart, you're home." The note that was building inside him stopped. The firebird flickered. The beach was there, behind the kitchen, in the next thought. The waves were coming in. The sky was a black bowl. The stars were stars again, not screaming static. The cathedral underwater stopped. He stood in his kitchen with his mother smiling at him, and behind her was the beach, and behind the beach was the silence, and inside the silence was nothing but Kami's voice. "Babe," Kami's voice said, inside the smoke. "Babe, I got you. Come back to me. Come back, fam. Come back. You're done. The Nomus are gone. The city is okay. You did it. You're done. Come down. Come down, Izuku. Come down, come down, come down." The firebird folded its wings. The wings folded slowly. The mile-wide span gathered inward. The light dimmed. The aura around him collapsed inward into a small shell around his body. The pressure on the buildings beneath him released, and the cracking stopped, and the gravity that had been bending the air column went away. The glass stopped breaking. The streetlights straightened. The air, very slowly, began to behave like air again. His eyes guttered down through white gold, through faint green flicker, and back to ordinary green. He began to fall. He fell out of the night sky like a body, because that was what he was, a body. He fell 500 meters with the last of his coherent telekinesis, pushing back against his fall, slowing him, letting him drift downward through the air like a wet leaf. He came down through the heat haze of his own departing aura. He came down through the smoke of Kami's glamour. He came down with tears running off his face into the air behind him. He landed on the street, next to the alley where Stain had dropped his sword. He landed on his side. His knees folded. His head was full of nothing. His chest worked. He looked up at the night sky he had nearly ended, and the night sky looked back down at him, and it was an ordinary night sky now, full of stars and the small lights of news helicopters that had been hovering at a respectful distance. Kami reached him first. She had jumped from the building. She had used her mentor's safe fall illusion to break her landing 2 streets away. She had run the rest. She crossed the avenue in a sprint with her hat in her hand and her hair coming out of its tie. She saw him on the street. She did not slow down. She skidded to her knees beside him. She gathered his head into her lap. He looked up at her. She looked down at him. Her face was streaked. Her eyes were red. She was breathing hard. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with how she looked and everything to do with the fact that she had come. "Hey, fam," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "Hey, I got you. I got you." He could not speak. He clutched her uniform with both hands. He fisted the fabric of her collar. He pressed his face into her thigh. He wept. He wept openly, the way he had wept on the beach the first time, the way he had not been able to weep at the USJ, the way he had not been able to weep on the porch with Gran Torino. He wept because he had come within a breath of being the thing he had spent his entire life refusing to be, and the thinness of the breath was something he could now feel in his bones. Kamiya held his head. She bent over him. Her tears fell into his hair. She said his name. She said it again. She rocked him very slightly. She put her hand on his cheek. He turned his face into her palm. The smell of her glamour was still faint in the air around them. The smell of pink smoke, the smell of beach salt, the smell of his mother's kitchen. Above them, in the distance, sirens were beginning to move toward Hosu. Police, ambulance, hero agencies. The news helicopters were closing in. The dust of 6 dismantled nomas was settling on the rooftops of 3 districts. Stain was still on his knees in the alley, watching the boy on the street with his sword on the asphalt beside him. Ida was alive. Native was alive. The city, despite the cracks in its windows and the streetlights it would need to straighten, was alive. Izuku Midoriya, 15 years old, was alive. He was a multiversal threat with a face that looked younger than 15. He was the host of a god that wanted to burn worlds. He was the boy who had stood next to a tiger he had raised from a cub. He was the student who had won the sports festival with bleeding nostrils. He was the son who had been carried home by his mother for years. He was the boy who had come within one breath of ending a city and had come down only because a girl on a rooftop had pushed her glamour into his head and shown him the kitchen. He clutched Kami's uniform. He cried into her thigh. The line between being the world's greatest protector and its ending was thinner than a strand of hair, and he could feel it under his fingers, and he knew, with a knowledge that was bone deep and absolutely his own, that he was going to have to live the rest of his life on the right side of that strand. The sirens grew louder. The helicopters circled. He held on to her, and she held on to him, and the night went on around them, and somewhere in the dark of the city, the news cameras began their broadcasts about what had appeared in the sky over Hosu. And somewhere in the dark of the city, a man in a bar watched the footage and went very still and asked his bartender to turn the volume up. And somewhere in the dark, a hand made of dust began to twitch in the rubble of the USJ that had been excavated in evidence. And somewhere in the dark, Endeavor watched his son's televised match for the 4th time and pressed his thumb against the pause button on the moment Izuku had said it's yours. And somewhere in the dark, Gran Torino sat on his porch with a cup of cold tea in his hand and looked up at the gold afterglow in the sky and said, "To nobody. Good." The girl held. "Good." Kami kissed the top of his head. "Babe," she whispered. "Babe, I love you. I love you. Come back to me. We're going home." He nodded against her thigh. He could not speak. He nodded. The sirens reached the end of the street. Stain, in the alley, picked up his sword. He did not raise it. He sheathed it. He raised both his hands behind his head, slowly, and waited for the heroes to come arrest him, because something had changed inside his ideology that night, and he had a lot of thinking to do, and the thinking was not going to happen out in the streets. The pro-heroes arrived in numbers. The medics arrived. The cameras pressed against the police tape. Ida was put on a stretcher. Native was cut down from the wall. The wounded were attended to. The world began to do the work it always did after Izuku Midoriya had been at the center of something. The work of cleaning up, of cataloging, of telling itself a story it could live with. Kami did not let go. She held him on the street, in the open, in front of every camera, and she did not let him go because the boy in her lap had asked her to be his anchor without ever using the word, and she had accepted the job without ever needing him to use the word, and she had no intention of putting the job down. A blanket was draped over them. A medic asked if he was hurt. Kami said, "He's hurt. He's just not hurt in a way you can see, fam. Give us a minute." The medic gave them a minute. He gave them several. The cameras did not get a clear shot. The blanket was thick. The cameras went away eventually. In the deep dark behind Izuku's closed eyes, the radio static was finally a hum. He breathed in. He breathed out. He pressed his cheek against Kami's hand. The night kept going. The morning that came after was the kind of morning that comes when a city has spent its night watching itself almost end. Smoke from the dismantled nomas had settled across 3 districts as a fine gray dust that swept up under brooms. Yellow tape ran in long, curving lines around the rings of cracked pavement at the central impact site. Streetlights leaned the way reeds lean after a heavy current. The windows that had broken inward in concentric patterns that engineers would map for months. Izuku slept for a few hours in the back of an ambulance with Kami's jacket folded under his head. He woke because someone outside was speaking his name in the soft voice adults use when they are afraid of waking a child. He sat up. The man at the door was a pro hero he recognized from posters that had hung in his elementary school. The pro hero bowed to him. Izuku bowed back. He climbed out of the ambulance and walked into the morning, and the morning did what mornings do, which is continue regardless. Kami was already up. She had refused a separate transport. She had refused in the same breath the offer of a hotel room from one of the senior heroes and had instead curled into the front seat of the ambulance like a cat that had picked a sunny window. Now she was on the pavement next to it with a paper cup of coffee in each hand. She held one out to him. She said nothing about how she had spent the morning. He took the cup. He drank half of it. He looked at her over the rim. "You stayed," he said. "Big yes, fam." She sipped her own coffee. "Where else would I be?" He had no answer for that. He was learning, by degrees, that some of her questions did not require answers. They walked together out of the cordon. The pro-heroes parted around them the way water parts around a stone in a stream. The cameras at the outer line caught a few angles. None of the angles were good. Kami had pulled a curl of her smoke around the two of them as they crossed the line, a small distortion that made faces blur and footage stutter. And the broadcasts that morning would carry only the blurred shape of a girl in a shiketsu uniform and a boy with green hair walking out of the perimeter together. By noon, they were on a train back to Shizuoka. He slept against her shoulder for 2 stops. She did not move. She watched the country roll past the window and held his hand in her lap, and when he woke, she was still there, the same way she had been the first time he had ever woken up around her, on a beach that did not exist with the waves coming in. The press picked up the Hosu footage the way water picks up oil. By the end of the week, the clip of the Firebird over the city had played on every major network in the country and most of the major networks outside of it. The footage was always the same, a 6-second loop, captured at maximum lens distance, the moment when the wings spread to a mile across and the gold light bleached the sensors to white. Anchors use the phrase unprecedented psychic event. They use the phrase potential containment questions. They use the phrase imminent national asset within the first 72 hours before the government had even formally said it, because somebody on the inside of the committee had been talking to somebody on the outside, and the phrase was too useful to keep buried. The committee meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning at a small ministry building 2 streets from Masayue. Izuku was driven there in a black sedan that picked him up at home. Kami waved at him from the kitchen window. Inko stood at the door with a handkerchief in her hand that she was trying very hard to keep folded. He kissed her on the cheek before he left. He told her he would be back by lunch. He meant it. The conference room had 4 officials in it, a glass table, a pitcher of water, and a recorder running in the center of the table. The chair was a woman in her 60s named Itsuka Kurosawa. She had been a pro-hero before she had become an administrator. She had the eyes of a person who had seen things she could not unsee, and she met Izuku's eyes the way a hawk meets the eyes of another hawk. She did not blink. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table. The questions came in order. They were the questions he had expected. How long had he carried the entity? When had he first manifested at his current scale? What was the precise nature of his bond with the entity? Did he experience the entity as a separate consciousness or as an integrated part of his own? He answered every question briefly. He answered every question honestly. The recorder ran. The officials wrote things down. He could feel their pulses across the table. 4 people, 4 heartbeats, 3 of them faster than they were pretending. And he kept that information to himself. The committee chair set her pen down. She looked at him. She asked the last question. Midoriya-kun, can you guarantee that what occurred over Hosu City will not occur again? He considered the question. He looked at the table. He looked at the pitcher of water. He looked at his hands. He looked at the chair. No, but I can guarantee that every time it gets close to happening again, I will bring myself back. I have been doing that for 6 years. I intend to keep doing it. The room said nothing for several seconds. The recorder ran. The chair wrote one short note on her pad. She drew a small line under it. She looked up. She thanked him for his time. The other 3 officials closed their folders. Izuku stood, bowed, and left the building inside of 10 minutes. The committee's statement came out the following Monday. He was classified, formally and on the public record, as a Level S imminent national asset. The phrase meant what everyone who read it understood it to mean. None of them mentioned this. The statement also confirmed his continued enrollment at UA under government recommendation. The wire services picked it up. The morning shows ran it under a graphic. The cycle moved on to other things by Wednesday. He came home from the ministry on the Friday of the meeting and found his mother at the kitchen counter and Kami at the table. Inko had been wringing a dish towel for 2 hours. Kami had decided to do something about it by making tea, on the theory that tea was easier to be wrong about than waiting. She had set out 3 cups. The kettle was singing on the stove. The afternoon light through the curtain over the sink fell on the table in the same long, warm line it had been falling on for 15 years. He set his bag down. He hung his jacket on the back of his chair. He sat. The kettle finished its song. Kami poured. She slid a cup across to him. She slid one to his mother. She picked up her own. For a moment, the kitchen was the 3 of them and the sound of cups being set down. Inko looked at her son across the rim of her tea. She had been looking at him this way for years now, the way a mother looks at a child she has been allowed to keep, who has come home one more time, who is sitting at the same table where he sat as a small boy. The look had nothing performed in it. It was simply present. He felt it. He looked back. He smiled at her. She set her cup down and reached across the table and put her hand over his hand, and she said nothing, because she had already said what she needed to say 100 different ways across 100 different mornings. Kami watched the 2 of them. She did not interrupt. She drank her tea. When Inko had finished her hushed moment with her son and pulled her hand back, Kami set her own cup down on the table and looked at Izuku. "So I guess this is the part where we tell your mom," she said. He looked at her. "Tell her what?" Inko said. "That we're together," Kami said. She said it as easily as a person says the time, like in a girlfriend-boyfriend way. Low-key have been since around the USJ. We were just waiting for the world to stop trying to end so we could do the conversation. Inko looked at Kami. Then she looked at her son. He looked back at his mother. His face was warm. He had felt this conversation coming for months, and now it was here, and the having it was easier than the imagining it had been. He nodded once at his mother. "Yeah," he said. "We are." Inko set her tea down. She pressed both palms flat against the table for a moment, the way she did when she was trying to make sure she would float no spoons by accident. Then she looked up and her eyes were wet and she was smiling. "Kami," she said. "Auntie," Kami said. "You're going to come to dinner on Sundays." "Auntie, I have been coming to dinner on Sundays for 6 months. You're going to come to dinner on Sundays as my son's girlfriend now. Same dinner. Different dinner." "Okay, fam." Kami smiled at her. "Different dinner. Got it." Izuku laughed. The laugh came out small and surprised, the way his laughs always did when they surprised him. Kami reached under the table and took his hand. She held it in her lap. His mother saw her do it. His mother saw everything. His mother pretended to be very interested in her tea. That was how they told her. There was no ceremony to it. There was a kitchen and a window and a kettle that had finished singing and 3 cups and a girl who had walked into his life through a cloud of pink smoke and had stayed. He looked at the table and thought, in a way that surprised him with its plainness, that this was the part of his life that was his. The phoenix was his, and the responsibility was his, and the loudness was his, and so was this. The table, the tea, the hand in his lap, the woman across from him who had held him through every year of it. The thing inside his chest shifted. It did not stir. It settled. It liked this room. It had always liked this room. It liked the small woman at the head of the table and the loud girl at the side of it. And it liked, in the wordless way that the entity expressed preferences, the fact that the boy it lived inside was sitting in this room being held by both of them. The provisional hero license exam came 3 weeks later at a facility 2 prefectures over. The examinees were drawn from every hero academy in the country. The opening ceremony filled an auditorium with 200 teenagers in fresh uniforms, all of them rigid with the focus that comes from knowing they were about to be evaluated by people they could not afford to disappoint. Izuku stood in the UA delegation. Kami stood in the Shiketsu delegation across the hall. They saw each other through the crowd at the start of the ceremony. She tipped her hat at him from across the room. He bowed his head at her. 3 UA. Students standing near him noticed the exchange. 2 Shiketsu students standing near her noticed it too. Within an hour, the entire pool of examinees knew that the boy from Hosu was dating the illusion girl from Shiketsu, and the rumor traveled around the auditorium the way rumors travel through teenagers, which is to say, faster than the announcements at the front of the room. The exam was a layered thing. Disaster scenarios, rescue assessments, combat trials against examiners playing the role of antagonists. Izuku moved through his early sections with the smooth economy that had become his working style. He lifted collapsed beams with the steadiness of a person threading a needle. He held the structural integrity of a sagging bus, while the rescue team inside it pulled out the actors playing trapped civilians. He extended his awareness across a multi-floor evacuation simulation and tracked every heartbeat in the building and reported the location of every actor to the examiners before the actors had reached their positions. Kami was doing her own work in a different section of the facility. Her glamour had grown teeth in the last 6 months. Her illusions were denser. Her range had nearly tripled. She filled an entire simulated city block with a layered illusion that broke into chambers, each chamber containing a different scenario, and the examiners had to send 3 actors through it before they could agree that her work had been comprehensive enough to score. The 2 of them met for lunch at a long table in the cafeteria, and she sat across from him with her tray and stole half his rice. He let her. He had been letting her steal half his rice for 6 months. The other examinees at the table watched the rice stealing the way people watch a magic trick, because half of them could not understand how a girl who was supposed to be a high-level rival was sitting at the UA table, eating off the UA plate. Then Shishikura Seiji walked over. He was a Shiketsu 3rd year. He had a face built for disapproving of things, and a voice that matched it. He had spent the morning sections being told that his style was inflexible by an examiner he had not respected, and he had spent the noon hour cataloging which of the other examinees he could most easily make an example of in order to recover his standing. He walked over to the UA table with his hands behind his back and a courtesy in his bearing that did not extend to his face. "Midoriya," he said, "I would like a brief demonstration of cross-school technique, if you have a moment. With your permission, a small assessment." Izuku looked up from his lunch. He looked at Shishikura. He looked at Kami. Kami was looking at Shishikura with a flat expression. She had been at Shiketsu with him for a year and a half. She had opinions about him. The opinions were on her face. "What kind of demonstration?" Izuku said. "My quirk is contact-based. I would like to confirm the operational range of my technique against a high-level peer. It is for the assessment of our mutual readiness. Examiners are present." Izuku set his chopsticks down. He thought about it. He looked at the examiners at the back of the cafeteria. They were watching. They had been watching the entire exchange. He looked back at Shishikura. He shrugged. "Sure," he said. "Once." He stood up. He walked around the table. He stood in the open floor between the tables. Shishikura raised his hand. The quirk activated. The air around his fingers shimmered with the small, wet light of an ability that reshaped flesh. He touched Izuku's shoulder. The quirk reached Izuku's skin and found nothing to grip. The reshaping ability slid off the surface of his uniform, like a hand running over glass. Shishikura's expression flickered. He moved his hand to Izuku's bare wrist. He activated the quirk again. The same thing happened. His ability arrived at the skin and met a passive telekinetic field that lived a millimeter above the skin and operated without instruction, the way breathing operated without instruction. The quirk could find no purchase. There was nothing for it to grip. Shishikura's face changed. He tried a 3rd time. He pressed his palm flat against the side of Izuku's neck. He pushed the ability harder. He committed. The phoenix lifted its head. It lifted only the smallest fraction of an inch. It was the way a sleeping animal raises its ears at a sound. The air in the cafeteria changed temperature by a measurable amount. The examinees at the surrounding tables, without knowing why, went still. The fork in the hand of a student 2 tables over stopped moving toward his mouth. A shiketsu girl near the wall lowered her cup of water back to the table without drinking. The sound in the room contracted toward Shishikura's palm on Izuku's neck, the way sound contracts toward the eye of a held breath. Izuku looked at him. The look was without threat. The look was without anger. The look was the look of a boy who had just become aware that there was a small animal pressing on him and was waiting to see whether the small animal would understand that the pressing should stop. Shishikura took his hand away. He stepped back. He bowed once, abruptly. He turned around. He walked back to the shiketsu table without speaking. He sat down. He did not look at Izuku for the rest of the day. He did not look at most other people for the rest of the day. He passed the exam. He passed it cleanly. He attempted his ability on no one else. Kami watched him go. She turned her head back to Izuku. She picked up her chopsticks. She speared a piece of his pickle. "Damn," she said. "I was hoping he'd push it." That was him pushing it. Thus, that was him admitting it. She ate the pickle. Different thing. They both passed. Of course they both passed. The ceremony at the end of the second day was held in the same auditorium where the opening had been held, with the examiners on the stage and the new license holders in folding chairs in front of them. The licenses came in small white plastic cases with each examinee's photo on the card inside. Izuku received his. He turned the card over in his hands. He stared at the photo. His expression in the photo was the expression of someone who had been told to look at the camera and was attempting to comply while clearly thinking about something else entirely. His mouth was a flat line. His eyebrows were doing something a little disappointed. Kami leaned over to look at it. She made a small sound that was the sound of a person being unable to hold a laugh in. The sound came out louder than she had wanted it to. 2 shiketsu upperclassmen in the row behind them turned to look. She put her hand over her mouth. She failed to stop laughing. She took the card out of his hands. She put it next to her own card, which she had opened first, and her photo on her own card was a wide, easy grin, and his photo on his card was the disappointed mouth, and the contrast made her laugh harder. And she slid both cards into the inside pocket of her jacket and zipped the pocket and patted it. "I'm keeping these," she said. "Those are official documents," he said. "They're safer with me, fam." He looked at her. He looked at the pocket. He looked at her face. He gave up. He had given up on most things involving Kami 6 months ago. He smiled instead. The smile was the smile he had no habit of hiding from her, which was the small one with the soft eyes, the one that lived in the corner of his mouth and only came out around her. She caught the smile. She caught it the way she caught everything. She did not tease him about it. She just leaned her shoulder against his shoulder and watched the rest of the ceremony with their licenses in her jacket and his arm pressed against hers. And the auditorium filled up with the polite applause of the closing remarks, and from the back row of the examiner's panel, a pro hero whose face nobody at UA would have flagged as suspicious watched the 2 of them from under the brim of her cap and made a note in her phone that her employer would receive within the hour. The reconnaissance attacks came 2 months after the license exam on 3 hero agencies in 3 different prefectures in the same hour. The attacks were precise to the point of being almost decorative. Doors opened that should have been locked. So, files copied that should have been impossible to find. 2 security personnel were injured but not killed, both of them in ways that suggested injury was an acceptable cost, but death was an explicit avoidance. Nothing was destroyed that did not need to be destroyed. The point of the attacks was not damage. The point was the message of having been able to do them. Aizawa identified the pattern within 12 hours. He brought it to Nezu in the principal's office, sat down, and laid it out across the small desk. 3 sites, 3 patterns of approach, 3 ways of mapping how a hero agency responded under pressure, how fast did they coordinate, where were the gaps, who made decisions, and from where. Aizawa did not say the words at the end of his briefing. He did not need to. Nezu finished the briefing in his own head and folded his small paws on top of his desk and said 1 sentence in reply. Bring in Midoriya. The investigation team gathered in a conference room at UA that had been retrofitted with secure line equipment over the previous year. 6 senior pro heroes, 2 ministry officials, Aizawa, Nezu in his small chair at the head of the table. Izuku sat at the foot of the table with his hands folded and his uniform jacket on the chair behind him. He was the youngest person in the room by 8 years. He said almost nothing for the first 3 days. He listened to every briefing. He read every file. He let the others speak. He was, by everyone's account, the most attentive person at the table. On the morning of the 4th day, after another briefing had concluded without producing a new direction, he asked Nezu privately for permission to extend his psychic awareness across the attack sites. He explained what that would involve. He explained the range, 4 kilometers around each site, sustained for several minutes, and the kind of information it might surface. Nezu listened with his head tilted. Nezu thought about it for the length of a single sip of tea. Then Nezu said, "Yes, do it today." Izuku did it that afternoon. He went to the first site alone. It was a hero agency in Kobe. He stood on the sidewalk across the street from the front entrance. He closed his eyes. He let the field extend. The extension was the kind of thing he had practiced with Gran Torino for months. It was the use of his awareness as an instrument fine enough to feel the temperature of a single sheet of paper at a distance. He pushed it out at the same density as a thinking person's attention, in every direction at once. He reached 3 blocks. He reached 6. He reached the 4-kilometer mark. The field was thin at the edges. He held it. He read. He felt the residue of every concentrated human presence that had passed through the area in the previous 72 hours. He felt the heartbeats of every person currently inside the buildings within the radius. He felt the slow, long fade of emotion left behind by people who had been afraid or determined or distracted in the area. The residue was layered the way smells are layered. He sorted through it. He found the operators. They had moved through the agency in a coordinated pattern. He could trace their paths the way a tracker traces footprints through grass. The residue they had left was an even mix of fear and focus, and the fear was the part that interested him. It was not the fear of being caught. It was older than that. It was the kind of fear a person carries when they have been working for someone they cannot stop working for a long enough time, that the fear has stopped being a feeling and has become a part of the body's ordinary operating state. Worn fear, inherited fear. The fear of a person who has watched what happens to people who stop following the orders of the person they follow. He pushed past the fear and tried to read the source. He found the shape of the source the way a person feels a wall in an unlit room. The source was something he had never read before. It was old. It was layered. The weight of it was the weight of accumulated centuries of will pressed into the shape of a human signature. It was the texture of a thing that had been gathering itself in this world for so long that its presence had become a part of the structural integrity of certain kinds of fear. He felt the operator's obedience as a thread running back from each of them towards something that lived behind a door he could not see, but which was there, definitely there, and which was older than every pro hero in the room he had left behind at UA. He pulled the field back in. He opened his eyes. He breathed for a moment on the sidewalk in Kobe with his hands in his pockets and the traffic moving past. He took the bullet train back to Tokyo that night. He went home. He ate dinner with his mother and Kami. He did not say anything about the field at dinner. He sat at the table and listened to Kami tell Inko about a thing that had happened on the Shiketsu campus that day. And he held Kami's hand under the table, and he saved the report he was about to write for the morning. He wrote it in 3 pages. He delivered it to Nezu before first period. Nezu read it. Nezu read it twice. Nezu set it down on his desk and looked at Izuku, and for the first time since Izuku had met him, Nezu's expression contained something other than amusement or strategic interest, or the small distant warmth he reserved for students he had decided he liked. The expression contained the recognition of an old, real threat, and the absence of any uncertainty about what they were now facing. "Thank you," Nezu said. "I will reconvene the investigation. You are released from the team." Izuku raised his eyebrows. "Sir?" "You have found us our enemy," Nezu said. "From this point forward, the investigation needs to be conducted by people whose names cannot be used as leverage against you. You will be informed of developments. You will be brought back in when we need you. Until then, you are to remain on campus, attend your classes, and continue your training. Is this clear?" It was clear. Izuku bowed. He left the office, he attended his classes, he did his training. The investigation in the background changed direction. 3 weeks later, Aizawa stopped him in the hallway between periods. Aizawa did not look at him directly. Aizawa looked at the wall above his shoulder. "Your report was correct," Aizawa said. "We have a name. We are watching him. He is watching us. It is going to come to a head soon. Sleep when you can." He walked away before Izuku could answer. That night, Kami fell asleep on the couch in the Midoriya apartment with her head on Izuku's shoulder while he was reading. Inko came into the living room with a folded blanket. She covered Kami. She stood in the doorway for a moment afterward and looked at her son, who was looking at the girl asleep against him, and her face did the thing it had been doing since the night in the kitchen. The expression of a mother who had been allowed to watch her child be loved well and had chosen every day to be grateful for it, rather than afraid. Izuku looked up at his mother. She smiled at him. She turned off the lamp on her way out of the room. He sat there in the half-light with Kami's breathing soft against his collarbone, and he listened in the back of his head to the radio static singing the long songs at the edge of things, and he thought about the man whose name they were watching. He thought about the texture of the fear he had felt at the edges of the agency in Kobe. He thought about the weight of centuries pressed into a human signature. He thought about how, when this came to a head, he would be ready. He sat up most of the night. The attack came on a Thursday in late autumn, at 4 in the afternoon, when the light at UA was the orange of leaves and old gold, and the dust in the air looked like floating embers. Izuku was on the outer campus, running a coordinated response drill with 3 of his classmates against a simulated villain incursion. The drill had been called by Aizawa that morning. The simulated villains were pro-heroes wearing modified gear. The drill was the kind of thing that happened twice a month in rotation as part of the post-USJ overhaul of campus security training. Izuku had been told on the way in that it was a routine exercise. It was not a routine exercise. The first sign was the timing. The second was the scale. The third was the fact that the simulated villains were good, the kind of good that came from having trained against high-level students for years, rather than being briefed about them that morning. The fourth was the simultaneous alert that came through Aizawa's earpiece while the drill was underway, audible to Izuku at his range as a faint tinny voice across the campus. The alert was that 2 hero agencies, one in Yokohama and one in Sendai, were under coordinated attack at the same moment. Izuku stopped moving in the middle of the drill. The simulated villain who had been about to engage him stopped too, because the simulated villain was in fact a pro-hero, and the simulated villain had also heard the alert through her own gear. The drill paused around them in a ripple of drop postures. Izuku raised one finger to his temple. He extended his awareness. He pushed it out across the campus first. The campus held. The students inside the campus were inside the campus. The walls of his school were still the walls of his school. Nothing in the immediate range was wrong. He pushed the field wider. He pushed it across the city. He pushed it across the prefecture line. He pushed it across 320 kilometers, sustained at thin density, and at the far edge of the field he caught a signal he had been able to identify since he was an infant. His mother's heartbeat. It was elevated. It was elevated in the way that meant fear. He locked onto it. He pushed the field around it. Around her heartbeat were 5 other heartbeats. 5 operators positioned around her apartment building. They had moved in fast. They were waiting outside the upper floor. They had set up a containment field around the floor she was on. The field was a quirk-based architecture. It was sophisticated. It had been designed to contain a pro-level threat. Behind the 5 operators at the edge of the building's lobby was a 6th presence. The 6th presence had no heartbeat. The 6th presence had the same texture he had read in Kobe. It was the centuries. It was the weight of accumulated will pressed into the shape of a man. standing in the lobby of his mother's apartment building, 320 kilometers from where he was standing now, on a campus where the drill had just been called as a distraction, and the agencies in Yokohama and Sendai had been called as distractions, and the entire architecture of the afternoon had been engineered for exactly this moment. The moment Izuku Midoriya understood that the man whose name they had been watching them right back. His pulse did one slow thing. It did one slow thing only. He left. The drill around him did not register the leaving so much as the absence afterward. The air in the corridor where he had been standing displaced in a single sharp crack of pressure that knocked the simulated villain backward 2 steps. A line of scorch ran along the floor tiles behind where his feet had been. The outer wall of the corridor had a hole in it the shape of a body in motion, with the edges of the hole melted clean and the brick still glowing at the rim. Aizawa, in the control booth, watched the security camera feed from a clear image of his student to a blurred line and then to an empty corridor with a hole in the wall. And Aizawa said one word into his headset, and then Aizawa ran. Izuku covered the 320 kilometers in 90 seconds. This was beyond flight. This was beyond teleportation. He was a body being pushed through the air by a telekinetic force routed through itself at a velocity that broke the sound barrier twice, and 3 times, and again, with the air parting in front of him in a tight cone that compressed and rolled around his shoulders the way water rolls around the prow of a ship. The cone radiated a wake of golden light. The wake was visible from the ground. He passed over 5 prefectures. The shadow he threw on the cloud cover was visible from satellites. The atmospheric instruments at the National Meteorological Agency registered the passage as a transient pressure event and started writing protocols around it within the hour. He came down on the roof of his mother's apartment building so fast the building shook. The operators on the upper floor were turning toward the sound of the impact above them. They were good. They were the best of what All for One could buy. They had carried stolen quirks for years. They had trained in their use against simulated heroes. The 5 of them moved in coordinated patterns. One of them, the field operator, was already adjusting the containment architecture upward to absorb the threat. The other 4 were moving in pre-rehearsed positions to intercept. Izuku came through the roof. He came through it the way water comes through a paper wall. The concrete and rebar of the building's upper structure parted in a clean circle around him and fell inward, and his telekinesis caught every piece of the falling material before any of it touched the floor of his mother's apartment. The pieces hung in the air around him, suspended, while he stood on the floor of her living room and looked at the 5 operators in the hallway outside her door. He looked at the first. The first operator had a stolen quirk that hardened his skin into a metal-like substance. He had built his career on absorbing impacts from things stronger than he was. He raised his arms in a defensive posture out of training rather than thought. Izuku raised one finger. The first operator's body lifted 3 inches off the floor, was rotated 90 degrees in the air, and was deposited against the far wall with his arms pinned and his quirk active uselessly against an embrace of telekinesis that was holding him at a pressure his hardened skin could feel through the metal. He could feel it pressing on his cells. He stopped fighting. He had been working for All for One for 11 years. He had never felt anything press on his cells before. He went still. The second operator had a quirk that fired condensed kinetic bolts from his palms. He fired one. It moved at high speed across the hallway. Izuku turned his head a fraction. The bolt arrived at the air in front of him. The air in front of him caught the bolt the way a pillow catches a thrown coin. The bolt deformed against the field, lost momentum, hung in the air, and dropped to the carpet. The second operator fired 2 more. The same thing happened. He stopped firing. He looked at his palm. He looked at Izuku. He sat down on the floor of the hallway. He had decided, in the time it had taken the 3rd bolt to fall, that this was an engagement he was going to lose, and he had decided to lose it on the floor rather than on his feet. Izuku held him in place where he sat. The 3rd operator had an organic quirk that produced an aerosolized neurotoxin from a gland in his throat. He opened his mouth to release it. Izuku raised 2 fingers. The operator's larynx closed. The gland sealed. The operator clutched his throat. The seal was a finely held telekinetic compression that prevented the gland from operating without harming any of the surrounding tissue. He could breathe. He could swallow. He could not produce his quirk. He sank to his knees. Izuku held the seal in place. The fourth operator was the containment field architect. She was a small woman with a brilliant quirk and a great deal of training. She tried to expand the field upward to contain Izuku inside it. The field architecture met his own field and broke against it. Her field collapsed inward and dispersed like a soap bubble. She stared at her own hands. She had spent 15 years building that ability. She had spent 11 of those years working for the man who paid her. The ability had defined what she was. Izuku flicked his finger. She lifted off the floor and was set against the wall next to the first operator, held in the same embrace, her field gone, her hands at her sides, her eyes wide. The fifth operator was the team leader. He drew a sidearm. He fired 3 rounds at Izuku at point-blank range. Izuku tilted his head a fraction. The 3 rounds slowed in the air, halted, hung suspended at the level of his chest, and dropped to the carpet with 3 small thumps. The sidearm in the team leader's hand crumpled inward in the same motion, the slide jamming, the magazine springing loose. The team leader looked at the ruined weapon. He looked at Izuku. He turned and ran for the stairwell. Izuku let him reach the door, then he pinched. The team leader's center of mass redirected itself. He skidded along the carpet and came to rest against the door of the stairwell, conscious, breathing, unable to stand. Izuku held him there. He turned. He walked across the hall to his mother's apartment door. He pushed the door open with his hand because he wanted to push it open with his hand and not with his mind. The hinges had been damaged by the operator's entry. The door swung in. His mother was in the center of the living room. She was sitting on the floor against the couch, with her knees drawn up. She was wearing the apron with the embroidered fox on it that she had been wearing in his glamours for years. Her face was streaked. Her hands were trembling. She had heard the sounds in the hall. She had heard the impact above her on the roof. She had been preparing herself for whatever came through her door. And what came through her door was her son, with his hair lifted slightly in a current that came from nowhere, and his eyes the banked gold of a fire he was holding inside himself. She saw his eyes. She did the thing she had always done. She got up. She crossed the room. She pulled him into her arms before he could speak. He held her. His hands were steady. His skin was warmer than it should have been. The gold in his eyes guttered down through ordinary gold and back to green. The phoenix folded its head and lowered itself back into his chest, because what it wanted was already in the room, and it had no need to come out for any of this, because none of this required it. She pulled back. She put both hands on his face. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him since he was 4 years old and 10 years old and every other age between. He let her. "Mama," he said, "you're here. I'm here. I'm okay. I know." She held his face for another moment. She breathed in. She breathed out. Her thumbs moved across his cheekbones the way they had been moving across his cheekbones for as long as he could remember. Then she lowered her hands. She nodded once, with the steadiness that she had built over 15 years of being the mother of a boy who could move buildings. "Go end it," she said. He looked at her. He nodded. Behind him, the apartment's intercom panel by the front door chimed. The chime was not the chime of the building's intercom. It was the chime of an external transmission being routed into the panel via an access protocol the panel had not been designed to allow. Izuku turned. The small screen of the panel lit up. A man's face appeared on the screen. The face was the face of a man whose features had been scoured at some point and had healed in patterns that did not quite recover. The healing had left him a mouth that had a thin, even line of a smile that lived in it, the way a coin lives in wax. The eyes above the smile were the eyes of a man who had been a long time in the world. The face spoke. The voice was warm. The voice was warm in the way a fireplace is warm when you have been told the fireplace contains a body. "Midoriya-kun," the voice said, "I do apologize for the interruption. I would have preferred a less aggressive introduction. I find theatrics distasteful. But I have learned over many years that some kinds of attention require an opening gesture. I am sorry for any distress this afternoon has caused your mother. I hope you understand that the gesture was, in some measure, the smallest thing I could have done that would have brought you to me at the time and place of my choosing. The voice paused. The face on the screen smiled, the small smile. I have prepared a meeting space, the voice said. I will send the coordinates to your phone. I think you will find the location appropriate. It has been built with our meeting in mind. I would like to discuss several matters. I think you will find the discussion interesting. I have been entertained, in my way, by the events of the last 6 months. I think it is time we move towards something with more weight. The face paused again. The small smile widened a fraction. Tonight, Midoriya-kun. Tomorrow, if you require the night to prepare. I would expect you to take the night. I would if I were you. I look forward to it. I have been looking forward to it for some time. The transmission ended. The screen went black. The intercom panel hummed itself silent. Izuku stood in the room for a moment. He looked past his mother. He looked past the panel. He looked at the corner where the wall met the ceiling, and he made himself breathe in and out 3 times the way Gran Torino had taught him. The phoenix in his chest watched the corner with him. It did not stir. It waited. He pulled out his phone. The coordinates had already arrived. The address was an industrial district at the edge of the city. The location was a building that the public records would have shown as a defunct warehouse. The records were a polite fiction. He typed Gran Torino's name into the call menu. The old man picked up on the second ring. He covered the distance to Gran Torino's apartment in 15 minutes. Walking, because he had decided to walk. The walking was the thing he was doing for himself. The phoenix had been awake for an hour. His skin had been radiating heat in a thin shell since the apartment in Shizuoka. The walking gave him time to talk himself down through the layers of the heat. By the time he reached the old man's door, his hands were ordinary boy's hands again, and the static in his head was at the low evening hum it lived at on most days. And he was a 16-year-old in his uniform with a phone in his pocket, and his mother safe behind him. Gran Torino opened the door before he knocked. The old man took one look at him, looked past him at the empty stairwell, looked back at him, and stepped aside. Izuku came in. The apartment was the same apartment it had been all summer. Takeout cartons, dusty books, the small porch out the back with a wooden floor that the late light moved across in the same slow lines it always moved in. They sat on the porch. The old man poured tea. Izuku did not drink his. The cup sat in front of him on the wooden floor. The steam came up off it and bent in a current that was the small radiant heat of his own body, and the steam did not behave the way steam should behave, and Gran Torino watched the steam without comment. For a long time, the old man said nothing. The sun moved an inch across the wood. The cup of tea cooled. "You're going," Gran Torino said. "Yes, sir." "Tonight? Tomorrow. He said I would take the night. He's right. I'm going to take the night." The old man nodded. He drank his tea. He set the cup down. "You're going to almost lose it in there," he said. I told you that on the porch 6 months ago. I'm telling you again, you're going to almost lose it. He has built a place for that. He has built the whole place around making it happen. He thinks if he can widen the distance between you and the thing inside you, the thing will do what he wants it to do. He thinks the thing will fight you. He thinks you'll fight back. He thinks the fight will leave him an opening. He's wrong. He's wrong. But you're going to feel like he's right for at least one moment in there. You're going to feel like the fight is real. I need you to remember something when you feel that. You are not the Phoenix Force. You are Izuku Midoriya, and you are carrying the Phoenix Force. There is a difference. The difference is the thing you go in there holding onto. You hold it all the way through. Even when it tells you to let go, you hold it. Izuku watched the steam off the cup. He thought about what Gran Torino was saying. He'd been thinking about it for 6 months. He thought about it now in the small, clear way he thought about everything in this old man's apartment, which was the way the sun on the porch made his thoughts go. "Sir," he said. I think I'm going to die." The old man looked at him. "That's a different thing," Gran Torino said. "That's a thing you don't get to decide ahead of time. You'd be a fool to walk in there expecting to live. You'd be a fool to walk in there expecting to die. You walk in there expecting to be there. The rest sorts itself out. Yes, sir. Did you call your girl? Not yet. Call her now. Then sleep on my couch. You can leave in the morning. You'll want the call done before you sleep, or you'll lie there all night thinking about whether to make it. Izuku looked at the old man for a long moment. The old man looked back. His eyes had the same flat absence of fear they had on the first afternoon Izuku had met him, the same absence they had probably had for 60 years. Izuku reached across the porch. He set his hand on Gran Torino's shoulder. The old man let him. They sat that way for a moment. Then Izuku took his hand back and stood up and walked into the apartment to find a place to sit by himself with the phone. He sat in the small alcove off the kitchen. He looked at the phone for a moment. He had rehearsed nothing of what he was going to say. He had never rehearsed anything he had ever said to her. He scrolled to her name. He pressed the button. She picked up on the first ring. "Hey, fam. Hey." He could hear her breathing on the other end. She had heard something in his voice already. She had been hearing the things in his voice already for a long time. "You good?" she said. Her tone was the tone she used when she was already deciding what to do about the answer. "I'm at Gran Torino's. Okay. I'm going tomorrow. I know. I'm coming back. Fam, if you think I don't already know that, you don't know me at all." He pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. He smiled. The smile was a small thing in the alcove where no one could see it. He let it be there anyway. He could hear her breathing. He could hear behind her breathing the faint sound of the television in her parents' living room and the small kitchen sounds of her mother making dinner, the sounds of a house that did not know it was being listened to by a boy who would have done anything to keep them safe. "He's coming for everyone. I love after this," he said. "If I let him have tomorrow, he'll do it slow. He'll do it the way he started today. My mom was the first one because she's the easiest. You're the second. Then he'll work his way through the class. Then he'll widen out. He has the patience for it. He has the resources. He's been doing this for 100 years. "I know," she said. "You're going to be at my mom's tonight. I'm already on the train." "Kami?" "Yeah." "I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a long pause. He could hear her settling into the seat on the train. He could hear her pull her hat lower on her face the way she did when she did not want the people in the next row to see her. He could hear, very softly, the catch in her breathing at the edge of the next thing she was about to say. "Okay, fam," she said. The voice she used was the voice she used on the beach the first afternoon she had ever spoken to him, and her voice had cracked slightly on the "okay," and she did not acknowledge that it had cracked. "Okay, so here's the thing. I've been thinking about it, about what to say if you ever called me before something like this, and I had a whole speech, like a real speech, with structure and stuff. But I'm not going to do the speech for me, not for you. So I'm going to say one thing instead. Are you listening, fam? I'm listening. You come home tomorrow," she said. "I don't care what you have to do to come home. I don't care what you have to be when you come home. You come home, you bring whatever you've got left back to the kitchen, we'll figure out the rest. We always do. Okay. Okay. Say it back. I'll come home. Good." She breathed out. The breath shook at the end. "Good. Okay. Good. I love you. Go to sleep. I love you. Good night." She hung up first. She had been hanging up first their whole relationship because she had decided early on that he would lie on the line trying to think of something else to say if she stayed on, and she did not want him to do that. He set the phone down on the small table in the alcove. He sat for a moment with his hands on his knees. He looked at the wall. He breathed. He went into the living room. Gran Torino had set a folded blanket on the couch. The blanket was thin and slightly worn. It smelled faintly of dust and lavender in equal measures, the way everything in the apartment smelled. He lay down on the couch. He pulled the blanket over himself. He closed his eyes. The phoenix in his chest turned, slowly, like a banked furnace. The static in his head sang the long songs of dying things at the edges of creation. The static had always been there. The static was the sound of the universe through the only ears that had been built to hear it. He had stopped being afraid of the sound a long time ago. in increments, on porches and in kitchens and on beaches that did not exist, and what was left now was the sound itself, which was the sound of the world. He listened to it the way a person listens to rain. He slept. The morning came up gray and full of a wind that smelled like a season that was going to turn soon. Izuku ate a bowl of plain rice at Gran Torino's table. The old man poured him tea. They said nothing. Izuku set the empty bowl in the sink and washed it and dried it and set it on the rack. He turned to the old man. "Sir, go on. Don't say it. I know what you were going to ask. The answer is yes. Your mother and your girl will be looked after. Aizawa and I have an arrangement. They will not be alone for the next 48 hours regardless of what happens to you. Walk out my door without that worry." "Thank you." "Walk out my door." He walked out the door. He walked across Tokyo on foot. He took no train. He did not push off the ground. He walked the surface streets at the pace of an ordinary person because the walking was the last thing he had that belonged to the boy who lived in this city. He passed a bakery he had stopped at with Kami once. He passed a bookstore where he had bought a notebook for his mother on her birthday. He passed children walking to school in their small uniforms with their oversized backpacks. He noticed every one of them. He held each one in his attention for a moment. As he passed, he felt their heartbeats. He moved on. The industrial district was on the southeastern edge of the city. The building above the meeting space had been a warehouse on paper for 30 years. The warehouse had a loading dock and a chain-link fence and a faded company logo on the wall. Izuku stopped in front of the fence at 20 minutes past 9 in the morning. He looked at the warehouse. He extended his awareness. The structure below went down 9 levels. The deepest level was at a depth of 400 meters. The walls of every level were reinforced with a layered composite that had been engineered to absorb thermal and kinetic events of significant scale. The structure was designed to fail upward, to channel the force of an interior detonation outward and skyward, in the direction of empty industrial space rather than population centers. Above the warehouse, on the surface streets, the population density was the lowest in the city. The placement was a piece of work. Decades of work, All for One had built a stage that was prepared to lose itself, on the assumption that what would lose it would be the host trying to burn his way out and up. Izuku put both hands in his pockets. He thought about this for a moment. He thought about a boy who had spent 6 years learning to burn inward. He walked through the chain-link fence. The chain-link parted around him in the same circular way the concrete of his mother's roof had parted. He walked across the warehouse floor. The warehouse had a freight elevator at the back, with brushed steel doors and a panel that lit up at his approach. The elevator was waiting for him. The elevator was a hospitality. He stepped into it. The doors closed. The elevator descended. It descended 9 levels. The phoenix in his chest sat up. The static in his head changed pitch. He let both things happen. He stood in the elevator with his hands in his pockets and the descent counting down through the small light above the door. The doors opened on the first level. There were 2 operators in the corridor. He stood in the open elevator and looked at them. They looked at him. He was, by the standards of every reasonable assessment in their training, the most dangerous person they had ever been asked to engage. They were professionals. They knew this. They had been told this. They had been told also that they were a delay rather than an obstacle, and that their job was to extract a small amount of attention from him on his way down, and that their compensation reflected the fact that they might not survive the extraction. He offered them what he offered everyone. He said it without raising his voice. Stand down, leave through the elevator, you walk out, you go home, you take whatever you have been paid, and you live. The first operator raised her weapon, which was a focused energy device built around a stolen quirk. Iwus, the second operator, engaged his own ability, which let him move at velocities that exceeded the response time of most opponents. Izuku watched them choose. He felt sorry for them in a way that did not slow him. The first operator fired. He turned the energy beam back along its own path and into the device, which overloaded inside her hand. She dropped it and stumbled backward. He held her in place against the wall. He held her with a soft enough pressure that she could breathe and a firm enough pressure that she could not lift her arms. He left her there. The second operator moved. He moved at a velocity that was, in absolute terms, impressive. He covered the distance between himself and Izuku in a fraction of a second. He arrived in front of Izuku with a strike already in motion. Izuku had been tracking him at every step. He raised one finger. The second operator's velocity reversed, smoothly along the same vector, and the operator was moving in the opposite direction at the same speed. He hit the wall behind himself with a thud and slid down it. He stayed conscious. He stayed breathing. He stayed in place. Izuku held him there too. He walked past them both. He took the staircase down to the next level. The elevator was, he had decided, a hospitality he would only accept once. The next level had 4. The level after that had 6. The level after that had 3. And one of the 3 was a man with a quirk that warped local gravity. The gravity quirk caught Izuku at the edge of the corridor and crushed downward at a force that would have flattened a pro hero. Izuku held the force off the floor for a moment, examined it, found the shape of how the quirk routed itself through the user's nervous system, and gently pinched the routing. The quirk released. The user collapsed against the wall with his hand on his neck. Izuku held him in place. He moved on. The level after that had a single operator. The operator was the only one of the descending tiers who had been given the option to leave before Izuku arrived, and the operator had chosen to stay. She had been working for All for One for 31 years. She had a quirk that allowed her to redirect the kinetic energy of incoming attacks back at their source at twice the original force. She had killed 3 pro heroes with the quirk over the course of her career. She was in her 50s now. Her hair was gray at the temples. She stood at the end of the corridor with her hands at her sides and her eyes on him. He stopped. He looked at her. He felt the shape of her quirk. He felt beneath the quirk the shape of the years she had spent serving the man at the bottom of the building. He felt her decision to stay. He felt that the decision had nothing to do with loyalty and had everything to do with the fact that she had decided some years ago that she would die in this corridor rather than spend any more of her life being told what to do by anyone. He extended his awareness 1 degree further. He read her name from the surface of her thoughts. He held the name in his attention for a moment. He looked at her. "You don't have to," he said. "Walk through the door behind you. The door leads to a stairwell. The stairwell leads up. You walk up, you leave. I let you. Nobody else needs to know." She looked at him. "What you're going to do down there?" She said, "Are you going to finish it?" "Yes. All of it. All of it." "He's been alive for a long time." "I know." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, with a movement that involved the entire upper part of her body, in the way a person nods when they have come to the end of something. She turned. She walked through the door behind her. She climbed the stairwell. She walked out of the building 2 minutes later. She walked into a small park 3 blocks away. She sat down on a bench. She did not move from the bench for the rest of the morning. The bench was where the senior heroes would find her. Hours later, when the operation above ground had reached the perimeter, she would give them everything she had on the network. Her information would unwind half of the remaining infrastructure of the organization before the week was out. She would receive a sentence that was the lightest sentence ever given to anyone with her record. She would live another 23 years. She would die in her sleep in a small house by the sea. Izuku would never know any of this. He walked past her empty corridor. He took the staircase down again. The last operator was on the 8th level. He was waiting in the corridor outside the doorway to the final chamber. He was a large man in a black suit. He had no quirk. He had been chosen for this position because All for One had decided, with the kind of preference that long-lived men develop, that the final guard before his meeting room should be a normal human being, as a small note of taste. The man had served All for One for 40 years. He had been the last one left who had served him personally, in the way that the others had served the network rather than the man. He stood in the corridor with his hands folded in front of him and his face entirely without expression. Izuku stopped. He looked at him. "Sir," Izuku said, "you're free to leave. He has paid for my loyalty for 40 years. That is the past tense already. Walk out. I prefer to stand here." Izuku looked at him. He nodded. He did not engage him. He simply stepped around him and pushed the door of the final chamber open with his hand. The man in the black suit stood in the corridor as Izuku passed. He watched Izuku walk into the chamber. He kept his head facing forward. He stood facing the wall. He would still be standing there an hour later, when the chamber behind him had become a different kind of space, and the man at the end of his loyalty had become a different kind of memory. He would walk out of the building under his own power that afternoon. He would never speak of any of it to anyone. The story is not his. The final chamber was a vault. It was the size of a small concert hall. The walls were a layered composite of materials engineered for absorption. The ceiling was a vaulted dome of reinforced material that arched 20 meters above the floor. The floor was a slab of seamless gray stone, polished to a low sheen. The chamber was lit by recessed panels along the walls. The light was the kind of light that was meant to imply mastery of its own temperature. At the center of the chamber stood All for One. He was a tall man. He was taller than he looked in any of the images the investigation had collected, because his presence in person had a weight that added height to him. He wore a long coat the color of pressed coal. His face was the face of a man whose features had been scoured at some point and had healed in patterns that did not quite recover. The healing had left him a mouth that had a thin, even line of a smile that lived in it, the way a coin lives in wax. The eyes above the smile were the eyes of a man who had been a long time in the world. He inclined his head slightly when Izuku entered. Midoriya-kun, welcome. Thank you for accepting the invitation. Izuku stopped 20 paces from him. He kept his back straight. He looked at him. You're him. I am. I have many names. The one your school has been using for me is the one I have used the longest. It is as good as any. You attacked my mother. I did not. I attacked her building. I assigned operators to her building. I never personally engaged your mother, who I find by all reports to be a remarkable woman, and whose presence I do not require in this conversation. I would never have allowed her to be harmed. I needed your attention. I have it. We may proceed. You attacked my mother. Yes, All for One said. He inclined his head a fraction further. I attacked your mother. I apologize for it. If it eases the offense in any way, I want you to understand that I considered every other available approach before I chose her, and I selected her because she was the one approach that would bring you to this room, rather than to some other room where the negotiation would have been less productive. I have been studying you for 6 months. I would prefer to have this conversation here, and now while the conditions are right. There's no negotiation. Allow me a few sentences before you arrive at that conclusion. Some of what I am going to say will surprise you. I have been doing this for a long time. Izuku looked at him. He was supposed to be at this. He had told himself on the walk across the city that he would let the man speak. He had told himself that he would listen. He had told himself that he was strong enough to listen without being moved, because the listening was the small dignity he could give to the conversation, the only acknowledgement that the man across the chamber had been alive long enough to deserve to be heard once before he was answered. He held himself to it. Go on, he said. All for One, smiled the small smile. Thank you. I will be brief. I have, in my long life, observed many people who carried things that were larger than they were. I have observed, in particular, several who carried entities of the order of the one inside you. They were rare. They were rarer still in the time before the quirks. They were singular. None of them survived the carriage longer than a decade. Most failed in the first year. The few who lasted longer did so by becoming the entity rather than by remaining the host. The transition was always the same. The host's mind would, by degrees, surrender authority of its own preferences to the entity, and the entity would, in time, occupy the body in full. The host would become a memory inside the entity. The entity would walk the body until the body wore through. Then the entity would find a new host. He paused, his head tilted a fraction. You are 16, he said. You are 6 years into your carriage. You've already exceeded the survival window of most of your predecessors. You are doing this through what I can only describe as constant effort. I have observed you. I have observed the way you sit at tables. I have observed the way you hold your hands when you speak. I have observed the way you sleep. You are exhausted in a particular way that none of the standard exhaustion metrics will register, because the exhaustion is not your body. It is your separation from the thing inside you. You are using a fraction of your life every day to maintain a distinction that the entity has been ready to dissolve for years. Izuku said nothing. I am not your enemy, Midoriya-kun. I am the first person you have met who understands what is happening inside you. I have spent my life acquiring abilities. I know what it is to live with something larger than the human frame was built for. I know the small price you have paid for every year of your separation. I know the way your mother looks at you across the kitchen table when she thinks you are not looking back. I know the way your girl wakes up in the middle of the night to check that you are breathing. I know the weight you have carried and the people who have carried it with you and the small, bright life you have made for yourself inside the carrying. Izuku's hands stayed at his sides. The phoenix sat. The static sang. I am offering you an end to it. All for One said, I am offering you the rest of yourself. You have been holding the entity at the edge of yourself for 6 years. Allow it in. Allow the dissolution. The thing inside you wants this. You want this. The wanting has been there since the day in the crater, and you have spent your life refusing it because you were afraid of what you would become. I want you to consider in this moment the possibility that what you would become is in fact what you were meant to become. The boy you are is a stage. The entity is the destination. Allow yourself the destination. He smiled. The smile widened a fraction. And in the moment of dissolution, he said, I will be here. I will catch what was you. I will preserve what can be preserved. I have done this before. I have abilities in my collection that can hold the trace of a consciousness across a transition. The boy you are will not be lost. The boy you are will be kept by me in a form that allows the entity to walk freely without the boy as its weight free. The entity will be free. The two of you will, for the first time, be allowed to be what each of you was meant to be. And the world will receive the entity in a form that has been mediated by an experienced hand. I am, in this offer, the only friend you have in this room. I am, in this offer, the only person who has ever offered you what you actually need. He stopped. The chamber was hushed. He waited. Izuku watched him for a long moment. He did not look away. The thing inside him watched too. The thing inside him watched the man across the chamber with an attention that was not the attention of a passenger and was not the attention of a god. It was the attention of a being that had spent 6 years sharing a life and had developed in the sharing opinions about the people that the boy it lived with had been brought into proximity with. The entity had been forming an opinion about All for One since the elevator. The opinion was now complete. The boy and the entity were on the same opinion at the same time, in the same body, with no separation between them. Izuku spoke. You spent all that time watching me, but you watched the wrong thing. All for One tilted his head. What did I miss? You watched the gap between me and what's inside me. You thought it was a gap. It was never a gap. It was a conversation. We've been talking for 6 years. We're the same animal in 2 clothes. You missed the seam where we stopped being 2 things. All for One's smile flickered for the first time. It was the smallest update. The kind of update a man makes when a piece of information that he had factored in at a confidence level of 98% has just been revealed to be incorrect, and the cost of being wrong about the 2% is the rest of the morning. He smiled wider. The smile was a recovery. He bowed his head. Then we will proceed, he said. Differently. I had hoped for a different outcome. I am, however, prepared for this one. He raised one hand, and the chamber filled with everything he had brought to it. The first thing was gravity. He had a gravity quirk taken from a man whose name had been a footnote in a hero registry decades ago, and he could compress local gravity to a density that crushed steel. The compression rolled out from him in a sphere. The sphere reached Izuku. The sphere stopped at the edge of Izuku's telekinetic field. The 2 pressures met along a line that was the boundary between 2 forces. On one side was the accumulated weight of a stolen quirk operated by a man who had spent decades refining its use. On the other side was the field of a boy who had been balancing a single grain of rice in the air above his palm for 6 years. The grain of rice had taught the boy something about the difference between weight and intention. The intention won. The gravity sphere flexed against the field, found nothing to compress, and collapsed back into the man who had cast it. All for One adjusted his footing. The second thing was fire. He had a detonation quirk, layered with an accelerant, and he fired it as a barrage at maximum scale. The detonation came across the chamber as a wall of orange-white heat that should have leveled everything in front of it. The wall reached Izuku. The fire reached Izuku's skin and reversed direction. It poured into him. It poured into his palms and his chest, and the gold at the back of his eyes. It joined the furnace that had been waiting for it. The boy did not move. The fire that had been All for One's was now the boy's. The chamber was still again, except for the small dripping sound of the heat that had melted the stone in a ring at the wall had passed. The third thing was biological. He had a quirk that compromised cellular integrity at the molecular level, a quirk he had been refining for 40 years for use against the rare opponent who could not be reached by force. The quirk reached Izuku. The quirk found a body that had been rebuilt incrementally by the entity inside it for 6 years. Every cell in Izuku Midoriya's body had been touched, modified, reinforced. Small changes accumulated over thousands of days, so that what had been a boy was now a body that the Phoenix lived inside without breaking. The quirk encountered cellular integrity that matched nothing in its training data. The quirk failed to bind. The quirk slid off the surface of the body the way the reshaping ability had slid off 6 months earlier. The boy did not move. The fourth thing was erasure. All for One had taken an erasure ability from a source that appeared in no hero registry. The ability had been buried in his collection for years, against the possibility of an encounter with a high-level quirk user whose ability needed to be severed at the nervous system. He activated the ability. The activation reached Izuku. The activation reached the Phoenix. The Phoenix was not routed through a nervous system. The Phoenix was a thing that lived in a body and used the body the way a body used air. The erasure found a fabric it could not recognize. The erasure tried to grip and found no surface. The erasure failed. All 4 of the opening salvo had failed. The chamber was, for 1 second, silent. All for One said nothing. His face did the smallest thing it could do. He had been a long time in the world. He had seen many things that he had needed to update his calculations against. He had never updated his calculations this fast. His mouth, which had carried the small smile in the corner of it through every conversation he had had since the beginning of the century, lost the smile. The smile did not leave his face out of fear. It left his face out of accuracy. The face was now the face of a man who had begun to count. Izuku raised his head. His hair lifted slightly. His eyes went gold. My turn. The Phoenix manifested. The light flooded the chamber. It came out of him from every surface of his body at once. It bore no resemblance to the gold of the entrance exam, which had been the surface gleam of a boy who had been holding back. It was past the gold of Hosu, where a boy had almost lost the grip. It was white gold. It was the color of the heart of a star, the color of the temperature at which forgot whose atoms they had been. The light flooded the chamber and turned the air inside it into a medium that the light was inside of, rather than passing through, so that every surface in the vault was illuminated from inside itself, rather than from any particular direction. The recessed light panels along the walls went out. They were unnecessary. The chamber had its own light now. The Phoenix's wings spread. These were not the wings of Hosu, which had been the wings of an animal stretched to its full open expression in open sky. These were the wings of an animal that was inside a room and was filling the room because the room was where it had been asked to be. The wings filled the chamber from the polished stone of the floor to the apex of the vaulted dome above. The leading edges of the wings ran along the curve of the walls. The pinions of the wings were each the length of a city bus, folded in tight against the inside of the chamber, individual feathers of furnace light overlapping each other in patterns that made the air between them glow. The heat began. It was not the heat of combustion. It was the heat of a thing for which combustion was a slow and uninteresting process. a thing that operated at a heat that required no oxygen and produced no smoke. The walls of the chamber, which had been engineered to absorb thermal events of significant scale, began to weep. The reinforced concrete sagged, the steel within the concrete went orange at its bases. The polished stone of the floor began to flow at the boy's feet. In a pool a foot in diameter, the rock turning to a slow liquid, the way wax turns to a slow liquid at the base of a flame. The air bent. The sound was the worst of it for All for One, because the sound was not a sound he could resist with anything in his collection. It was the pressure change that the Phoenix's full presence introduced into every fluid in the chamber. It was the way the blood in his ears changed temperature. It was the way the lining of his lungs pressed outward against his ribs. It was the way his vision shimmered around the edges, not because of damage to his eyes, but because of the new way light was behaving in the chamber. It was the way all of the systems inside his body that he had spent 100 years optimizing began, one at a time, to report that they were being asked to operate in conditions they were not built for. He felt fear. He registered the chemistry. He updated. He still had moves. He had been All for One for too long to stop having moves while he was still breathing. He raised both arms. The cascade began. He fired everything. He fired everything he had brought into the chamber, every stolen quirk in the prepared sequence, in a layered output that was the combined strike of dozens of abilities, firing in sequence at maximum scale. The output was the kind of thing that should have leveled a mountain range. It should have, at minimum, broken the boy through every layer of defense at his disposal. The output came across the chamber as a single combined wave of force, heat, biological agents, kinetic projectiles, gravitational distortion, sonic concentration, light weaponization, frequency disruption, and at least 7 other categories of attack that the registry of hero abilities had no neat name for. The wave met the Phoenix. The Phoenix watched the wave. The boy at the center of the Phoenix watched it too. The boy and the Phoenix were watching it together now, as one observer, with one set of preferences about what the wave was going to do. The boy raised one hand. The wave parted around him, not absorbed, parted. The wave that should have leveled the chamber and the boy in it split into 2 streams, one passing on each side of the boy's body, the streams curving along the geometry of the Phoenix's wings on either side of him, and the 2 streams continued past him and rolled onto the walls of the chamber, where they were absorbed by the engineered composite, which began to fail under the load. The wave that had been intended for the boy was instead what was beginning to bring down the chamber. The chamber had been built to contain him in. The architecture of the trap was being cooked by the trap's own ammunition. All for One looked this. His mouth moved. He was trying to do the next thing. He was already calculating. He had 1 move left. He had been saving it. He had been saving it since the chamber had been designed, and he activated it now. The bond severing. He had taken the ability years ago from a source he had pursued across 2 continents. The ability was the rarest thing in his collection. It severed the connection between a person and their quirk at the fundamental level. It cut the psychic thread between a host and the power that lived inside them. It required close range. It required a moment of stillness in the target. He had been engineering both conditions across the entire confrontation. He had it now. He activated. The ability crossed the chamber in a thin, invisible filament that the cameras would not have registered. It reached Izuku. It found the thread between the boy and the entity. It cut. For 3 seconds, the Phoenix Force went silent. Izuku stood in the chamber. He stood in the chamber alone. The Phoenix's wings were still there. The light was still there. The heat was still there. But the thread between Izuku Midoriya and the thing he had been carrying since he was 10 years old was severed, and for the first time in 6 years, 3 months, and a number of days, he had stopped counting. The boy was inside his own body without the entity speaking inside his head. The static stopped. The cathedral underwater stopped. The choir of dying stars stopped. The hum of magnetic fields wrapping the corpses of distant worlds stopped. The signal of the entity's awareness, which had been a constant low light at the back of his skull for 6 years, went out. The room he was standing in was an ordinary room, lit by an ordinary light around an ordinary body, with ordinary thoughts inside the body. The body was just his body. The body was a thing he had not lived inside of for 6 years. He felt the absence first. It was the absence he had wanted in the worst moments. It was the silence Kami's glamour had bought him in fragments. It was the silence on the beach the first afternoon he had ever met her. It was the silence he had wept on his knees inside. It was, in this chamber, a horror. He understood, in the first second, that the absence was the absence of the only voice that had been speaking with him for 6 years. The voice he had been afraid of, the voice he had been hiding from, the voice he had been growing into the same shape as, the way two people who shared a house grew into each other's habits. He understood, in the first second, that the absence was the absence of half of his own conversation, and that the conversation had been more than half of who he was now. In the second, he reached. He reached without thinking. He reached the way a person reaches for the hand of someone falling, with no calculation, with no judgment, with no analysis of whether the reach would succeed. He reached out with the part of himself that was still a host, even when the host had been cut from the entity. The part of himself that knew in his bones that he had not been a passenger inside his own life, and that the thing he had been carrying had been no passenger either, and that what they had built together over 6 years had been a shared occupancy. He reached out for the Phoenix Force. And in the third second, the Phoenix Force reached back. He felt it from the outside. He felt the shape of it, the way a person feels the shape of a building when they have stepped outside of it for the first time after a long stay inside. He felt the entity. He felt that it was vast, vaster than anything he had ever felt from inside it. He felt that its awareness extended across distances the human language had no scale for. He felt the songs it had been singing inside his head from the outside now as the long structural pulses of a thing that lived at the edges of creation and was old enough to remember when the edges had been closer. And he felt underneath the vastness the small thing. The small thing was the entity's fear. It was a particular shape of fear. It was the fear of a living thing that thinks it is about to lose the only connection it has ever had to being known. The entity had crossed worlds to find a host who would not break. The entity had folded itself smaller and smaller until it could fit inside the chest of a 10-year-old boy. The entity had spent 6 years inside a small life made of a kitchen and a mother and a girl who breathed pink smoke into a phone, and the entity had grown to love the smallness of the life. The entity had grown to want the smallness. The entity had been afraid, for years and years, that the boy it lived inside would one day decide to push it out, and the entity had been working in its way to make sure that the boy never wanted to. The Phoenix Force had been just as afraid of losing him as he had been afraid of losing himself to it. He felt this. He held it. He understood it without words. The entity reached for him in the same wordless way, and the reach was a request, and the request was the simplest thing he had ever heard from anything. The request was, "Come back." He came back. The thread between them did not just reform. It came back at a different weight, because he had reached, and the entity had reached, and the two of them had agreed in 3 seconds of shared recognition that there had never been a passenger in either direction. They had been a single life in 2 clothes since the crater, and the only thing that had been a fiction was the distinction between them. They let the fiction go. His eyes opened. The white gold in them was a different white gold than the white gold of any of the previous manifestations. It had nothing of the white gold of a boy being consumed. It bore no trace of the white gold of an entity breaking through against resistance. It was the white gold of a single thing that had finally agreed with itself and was now operating without the small constant friction of a being that had been pretending to be 2 beings for 6 years. His hair lifted. The phoenix spread. All for One was looking at him from across the chamber. He had watched the 3 seconds. He had registered the silence. He had registered the moment when the bond severing should have produced the dissolution he had been engineering for months. He had been waiting, with a small smile back in the corner of his mouth, for the boy across the chamber to begin the unraveling. The boy had not unraveled. The boy had reached. The reach had been answered. The thread had reformed at a weight he had no measurement for. He understood, in that moment, that he had lost. He understood it with the clarity of a man who had been calculating for a long time and had finally been given a number that he could not work with. He understood it ahead of his body's recognition of it. He had a few seconds in which his mind was already on the other side of the loss, while his body was still arranged in the posture of someone who had been fighting. He used the seconds. He tried to speak. He tried to say something. He had a final speech prepared. He had a number of final speeches prepared against the possibility of various outcomes. He selected the speech that was most appropriate to this outcome. He opened his mouth to deliver the first line of it. He did not get the chance. Izuku Midoriya, fully agreed with himself for the first time in 6 years, raised his hand. The unmaking began at the edges. It started at the hem of All for One's coat, which was the part of him that the boy across the chamber was looking at when the boy made the decision. The fibers of the coat released their bonds. The fibers ceased to be fibers. They became, briefly, the constituent parts of fibers, and then they became the constituent parts of the constituent parts, and then they became light, and the light fed back into the wings of the firebird above. The unmaking moved up the coat at the speed of a thrown stone. It reached the man inside the coat. It crossed onto skin. The skin did the same thing the coat had done. It released its bonds. It became briefly the constituent parts of skin. It became the constituent parts of those constituent parts. It became light. The light moved into the wings above. The unmaking ran up his body. It found his face. All for One had time, in that fraction of a second, to do one last thing. He did not try to speak. He had no chance to call any of his remaining abilities to his defense. He looked at the boy across the chamber. He looked at him with the eyes of a man who had spent a century watching the world from a position of confidence and had been corrected in the final hour by the only thing that had ever corrected him. He held the boy's eyes for the small duration he had left. He did not bow or nod. He did the thing that, for a man like him, was the closest equivalent to an acknowledgement. He held the look, then his face was light, then he was light. The light flowed up into the wings above and was absorbed into the phoenix's body. The wings folded around the absorbed light and integrated it. The chamber, for a moment longer, contained the body of the firebird in its full presence. Then the firebird began to fold inward. It folded into the boy. The wings drew in along their edges. The light dimmed. The heat reduced. The chamber's walls stopped weeping. The pool of liquid stone at Izuku's feet began to harden, the way the loam in the crater had hardened, the way the floor of a corridor in a battle trial had hardened. The vaulted dome above the boy stopped glowing. The recessed light panels in the walls flickered back on as the chamber returned to a state where the panels were necessary again. Izuku stood in the chamber. The firebird folded down into his chest with the ease of something that had finally been given permission to rest. The white gold in his eyes guttered down through gold to faint green. His hair settled. His hands were at his sides. He was bleeding from his nose. The uniform he had walked into the chamber in was ruined at the edges from the heat. His skin was warmer than it should have been. He felt the entity inside him settling. He felt it settle in a way it had never settled before. As a single integrated part of him rather than as a presence he was hosting. There was no pile of dust this time. There was no severed hand. All for One had been integrated into the Phoenix completely, and the integration was the only proof of the ending. The chamber above Izuku began to come apart. He felt the upper levels failing through the structure. The trap had been built to fail upward in the event of a catastrophic interior event, and the catastrophic interior event had occurred, and the upper levels were now executing their failure as designed. He raised one finger. The collapse paused. He shaped it. He extended his awareness up through every level of the structure, found the man in the black suit who was still standing in the corridor, found the operators he had bound earlier in their various positions, found the elevator shaft, found the warehouse above. He held the structure in place against the failure. He gave each of the bound operators a small telekinetic nudge toward the elevator. The bound operators began, slowly, to walk toward the elevator, freed from their bindings, but not from his awareness, knowing in their bones that the walking out was being permitted by the boy in the chamber below. The man in the black suit in the corridor outside the final chamber turned for the first time. He looked at the door. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he walked toward the elevator without a word. Izuku stood in the chamber until everyone above him had walked out. Then he released the structural hold and began to walk upward himself. He walked up through the levels of the building. The collapse resumed behind him at the pace he had set, with the upper levels coming down in a measured manner that the engineering had been designed to allow. He passed through each level. He stepped around the falling pieces. The pieces fell around him in a circle that did not include him. He reached the warehouse floor. He walked across it. He stepped through the hole in the chain link fence he had made on his way in. He came out into the morning above. It was still gray. The wind was still the wind of a turning season. The morning had moved by perhaps 2 hours. The perimeter was 6 blocks wide. It had been established by the heroes who had received the emergency alerts in the first hour. They had triangulated his position from the satellite imaging of the displacement event in the sky over central Japan, and they had begun in the second hour to set up a containment zone around the warehouse. By the time Izuku surfaced, the inner cordon was a ring of senior pro heroes, the middle cordon was police, and the outer cordon was the press. There was a girl just inside the inner cordon. She had told the police that she was his partner and that they could either let her stand in the inner ring or she would put the entire block under pink smoke for an hour. And the senior hero in command had looked at her, looked at his radio, and decided that she should be where she had asked to be. Kami saw him surface first. She did not run, she walked. She had decided on the train from Shiketsu the night before that she was going to walk and not run when this happened, because the running would be for her and not for him. The walking was for him. She crossed the gap between the inner ring and where he had come out of the rubble. The senior heroes around the inner ring did not stop her. They watched her go. They said nothing. They stepped aside as she passed them. Not the way they had stepped aside when he had walked out of the cordon in Hosu 6 months earlier. She reached him. She stopped in front of him. She looked at his face. She looked at his eyes, which were ordinary green now. She looked at the blood under his nose. She looked at the state of his uniform. She was silent for a moment. Then she lifted her thumb to his face and wiped the blood from under his nose with it. "You look terrible, fam," she said. Her voice was steady. "I know." "You're back." "Yeah." She exhaled. The exhale shook at the end of it. She paid the shake no mind. She stepped forward and pulled him in, and he pressed his face into her shoulder, and neither of them spoke for a long while. Her hat tipped back on her head against his temple. Her hand was at the back of his neck. His arms were around her waist. The cameras at the outer cordon could not get a clear angle. The senior heroes at the inner ring kept their backs to the two of them and faced outward, blocking sight lines without anyone asking them to. Aizawa walked past the senior heroes from somewhere outside the cordon. He did not stop. He did not say anything. He looked at the two of them in the middle of the ring. He looked at the rubble of the warehouse behind them. He looked at the sky. He pulled out his phone. He texted Nezu. He kept walking. The morning kept going. He came home to his mother's apartment that evening. He had been delayed at the perimeter for several hours of briefings, of medical assessments, of formal statements, but the formal world had eventually let him leave. Kami was with him. Aizawa drove them both himself in his small, unwashed car because he had decided that he was going to be the one to bring his student home, and he had not asked anyone's permission to do it. He let them out at the corner. He drove away without saying goodbye. Izuku and Kami walked up the stairwell to the apartment door. He was tired in a way he had never been tired before. The phoenix in his chest was tired with him. He could feel the entity's tiredness as a part of his own. The two of them were on the same long evening together. The apartment door opened before he could reach for it. Inko stood in the doorway. She had been waiting. She had been waiting since the morning. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She had paced the kitchen for hours and then sat at the table and then paced again and then sat again. She had been told the engagement had ended in the early afternoon. She had been told her son was uninjured. She had spent the rest of the day waiting for him to come home because the telling and the seeing were two different things, and she had needed the seeing. She saw him in the doorway. She did the thing she had always done. She crossed the small space between them. She pulled him into her arms before he could set his bag down. He let her. He bent into her shoulder. He had been bending into her shoulder for 16 years. He had been bending into her shoulder since he was 4 years old and floating a car. The bending had not changed. The shoulder had not changed. The mother had not changed. He was in her arms, a body that had walked through a chamber and unmade the worst man this world had produced. And he was also a boy who had come home for dinner. Both things were true at the same time. Inko held both of them. Kami stood at the door. She let them have the moment. After a while, Inko reached out one arm and pulled Kami into the hug too, and the three of them stood in the doorway for a long minute, and the small hallway light over the door buzzed faintly the way it always buzzed, and the smell of dinner came from the kitchen because Inko had been cooking through her anxiety and had been unable to stop. And Izuku breathed in the smell of his mother's cooking, with his face in her hair, and the static in his head was the low evening hum it had been at on the morning of the entrance exam. And the radio static was the sound of the world, the way the rain was the sound of the world, and he was home. They ate at the table, the three of them. Kami sat across from Inko and made her laugh through the meal. Izuku watched the two of them and ate slowly. He was hungry. He had not realized how hungry he had been. He went back for seconds. His mother smiled at the empty plate the way she had smiled at his empty plates since he was small. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, the world had moved. The news coverage was the news coverage. He read none of it. Kami read some of it and reported only the small details that she thought he would find amusing and threw the phone aside otherwise. The government issued a statement which used phrases like the threat has been neutralized and an exceptional intervention by a licensed asset, and at no point did civilian populations face imminent danger. And the statement contained the polite fictions that the public required in order to continue with their mornings. The hero agencies issued their own statements. The hero academies issued statements. The press conferences ran for a week. He watched none of it. He stayed at home for 3 days. His mother made him soup. Kami did her homework at the kitchen table while he sat on the couch and looked at the ceiling. Inko sat in her chair and read her book. The three of them were a small, still thing in the middle of a country that had spent the week reorganizing itself around the absence of the man who had been at the center of half of its problems for 100 years. On the morning of the 4th day, his phone began to ring. It rang because the people he loved had given themselves 3 days to wait before they reached out, and the 3 days were over, and now they were calling. All Might called first. The call was brief. The big man on the other end of the line had nothing he needed to say that needed words. He said, hit his student's name. He said he was proud of him. He said he was at the school whenever Izuku was ready to come back. He said that he loved him in the small, careful way that a teacher uses the word with a student he had been watching since the entrance exam, and Izuku said it back, and they hung up. The call was 4 minutes long. All Might sat in his small apartment afterward and looked at the television that was still showing the same footage on every channel. And his face did the thing his face did when he had been watching something for a long time, and the watching was finally complete. He turned the television off. He sat for a while. Then he stood up and made himself a cup of tea, because he had not made himself a cup of tea in a week. And the making was a thing he was allowed to do now that the watching was done. Aizawa called second. The call was 3 sentences. Aizawa said, "Your absence from campus is excused for the rest of the week. The investigation is closed. Bring back the homework you missed when you return." He hung up. He had said what he needed to say. He went back to his office. He sat at his desk. He did not move for 10 minutes. Then he stood up, walked into the empty hallway, stood in front of the hole in the wall that Izuku had left on the afternoon of the attack, which had been covered with a temporary panel by the maintenance staff, but which everyone on campus knew was still there underneath, and he put one hand against the panel. He stood like that for a moment. He went back to his office, Bakugo placed no call. Bakugo watched the footage in his room. He watched it alone. He watched Izuku surface from the rubble of the warehouse. He watched Kami cross the cordon. He watched Aizawa drive past the senior heroes in his small, unwashed car. He watched the whole thing without making a sound. Then he stood up. He changed into his training clothes. He went to the gym at midnight because he was Bakugo Katsuki and he needed to do something with his hands. And the mountain he was climbing had just gotten taller. And the taller it was, the harder he was going to climb. He said none of this to anyone. He had no need to. The next time he saw Izuku in the hallway at UA, he gave him a look that contained the climb in it. And Izuku saw the look, and Izuku returned a small nod, and that was the entire conversation. They both understood it. They both understood that they were going to spend the rest of their lives being two pieces of the same childhood, and that the pieces were going to figure it out on their own terms, and that neither of them needed anyone else to be in the middle of it. Todoroki sent a text. The text was a single sentence. The text said, "I am glad you came home." The text was sent at 4 a.m. from Shoto Todoroki's phone, after Shoto Todoroki had spent the night sitting at his kitchen table, looking at the ceiling and thinking about a boy who had told him his fire was his own. Izuku read the text in the morning. He texted back. The text he sent back was, "Thank you. How is the left side?" The response came back inside of a minute. The response said, "It is mine." Izuku smiled at the phone. He set the phone down. The conversation was over. They both understood it. They both understood that they had nothing else to say. The not saying was the important part of it. Gran Torino made no call. Gran Torino sat on his porch. He had heard the news on the small radio he kept outside. He had picked up his cold tea. He had nodded once, slowly, to himself, and he had said to nobody, "Good. The girl held. Good." He had sat on the porch for a while afterward and looked at the sky. He had thought about the boys he had buried over a long career. He had thought about the small distance between burying them and burying this one, the way the distance had been so thin that a less attentive man would have missed it entirely. He had thought about the porch and the wood and the late light. He had been, in his way, content. He had finished his tea. He had gone inside. 2 weeks after the warehouse, on a rooftop in Shizuoka, the sky began to turn gold at the edges around 6 p.m. It was the rooftop of the building that the Midoriyas lived in. It was a flat roof with a low wall around it, and a single rusted satellite dish in one corner, and the kind of small wooden bench that the building's residents had installed without asking the landlord, who knew about the bench and had decided to pretend he did not. The bench faced west. The view from the bench was the view of the city stretching out toward the line where the city ended and the hills began. And beyond the hills, the sun came down at the speed it always came down, unhurried and warm. Izuku sat on the bench. Kami sat beside him. Her shoulder was against his shoulder. Her hat was tipped back on her head the way she always wore it when she was at home rather than at school. Her hair had grown out a little over the autumn. She had stopped pulling it back. She had decided around the start of the new term that she was going to let it be what it was. He had decided, in the same season, that he liked it. He had said this once out loud, the way he said most things to her, plainly. She had laughed at him for an hour. She had also stopped pulling her hair back the next morning. The sun moved down across the line of the hills. The light at the edge of the city was the gold of late summer and early autumn. The gold of a season that had decided to stay an extra week. He was holding her hand in his lap. She had given him the hand half an hour ago. He had been holding it since. The phoenix was in his chest. It was present. It was awake. It was resting the way large animals rest, which is to say that it was still itself and still capable at any moment of being everything it had always been, but was, for now, choosing the rest. The bond between them, since the chamber, had been a different bond. It had been the bond of a single life in two clothes, agreed upon and held, and the maintenance of it was no longer the maintenance of a separation. The static in his head was the steady evening hum of the world at its furthest edges, the long songs of stars he had stopped being afraid of. He could hear in the songs the beauty of them now. He had not heard the beauty for a long time. He had been hearing only the weight. The beauty had been there the whole time. He had just needed to be inside his own life enough to listen. He looked at the sky. He thought about a thing. Kami. I used to think the loudness was the price. Like, I got all of this, and the price was that I'd never get to be quiet. She turned her head a fraction to look at him. She did not speak. She let him say it. But it's not quiet that I want. I just want it to not feel like it's trying to eat me. Does it? She said. Right now. Does it feel like that? He thought about it. He looked at the horizon. He looked at the gold at the edges. He looked at her face. He looked at her hand in his hand. He looked back at the horizon. The phoenix in his chest shifted. The way an animal shifts in a sleep. The way an animal that has been given the long rest it has earned shifts in the slow afternoon. The shifting was a part of his own breathing now. The two of them were the same animal in two clothes. The two of them had agreed to be that animal a long time ago in a chamber under the city, and the agreement had not changed. No, he said. Right now it just feels like the world. She squeezed his hand. The sun moved another notch toward the hills. The light on the city turned a different gold. Somewhere below the building, a car horn honked. Somewhere inside the building, on a lower floor, a child laughed. His mother was in the kitchen, 4 floors below them, watching the evening news with a cup of tea in her hand, and the cup of tea had a small embroidered fox on the rim, because she had bought the cup a year ago after Kami had complimented the apron, and she had been unable to help herself. The television was a low background sound through her open window. The news was, that evening, about a different boy doing a different thing, and Inko had decided she liked when the news was about a different boy doing a different thing, and she was watching it with the small attention of a woman who had been allowed her son back. Kami leaned her head against his shoulder. Hey, fam. We should go on a date. We go on dates. A real one. Like a thing where I make you wear a button-up. Kami, you'd look so good. Come on, Saturday. There's that place by the station. They have the thing with the eggs you like. He looked at her. He smiled. Saturday. Saturday. She squeezed his hand again. She closed her eyes. She breathed in. The breath was slow and even. He felt her chest rise against his arm. He felt the small, steady thing of her pulse in her thumb against the back of his hand. He felt his mother's pulse 4 floors below. He felt the pulses of every person in every apartment in every direction. He felt the pigeons on the satellite dish in the corner of the roof. He felt all of it. He held it. He let it be the world. He was Izuku Midoriya. He was 16 years old. He was carrying a god that had dreamed of him before he had been born. He had loved a girl who had walked into his disaster without flinching. His mother was in the kitchen with a cup of tea. Tomorrow he was going to go back to school. The boy who sat next to him in homeroom was going to climb the mountain harder than ever. The boy with the burning left hand was going to text him at 4 in the morning when he had a thing on his mind. The old man on the porch in Tokyo was going to be on the porch drinking tea in the late light until he stopped. And even when he stopped, he would be on the porch in the memory of the boy he had taught, and the porch would be there. The hero with blue eyes was going to be at the school. The tired man with the scarf was going to be at the school. The school was going to be the school. The world was going to be the world. The line between being the world's greatest protector and its ending had been thinner than a strand of hair for 6 years. The line was still thin. The line would always be thin. But he had walked it long enough now that the walking had become a way of standing. And the standing was a thing he could do. He could do it next to her. He could do it next to his mother. He could do it in a kitchen, or on a porch, or in a chamber under a city, or on a rooftop at the end of a season that had decided to stay an extra week. The phoenix in his chest folded its wings. It settled in. It went, in its way, to sleep. The static sang the long songs of dying stars at the far edges of creation, and the songs were the songs of the world, and the world was the gold at the edge of the horizon, and the gold at the edge of the horizon was the gold at the edge of the horizon. And the girl beside him was still holding his hand. He watched the sun finish its descent. He held the hand back. The night came up behind them, gentle and slow, and the rooftop was the rooftop, and the world was the world.
The hero roster. A massive salute to the legends backing this journey. Your support is what keeps the momentum at an all-time high and the dream moving forward. You guys are the absolute best. Pro heroes. The elite front line, stepping up and setting the pace for the whole community. DA, Fire 05.
Symbol of peace. The pillars of the community. The titans who keep our foundations solid and the hype at an all-time high. Alexander Igarza. That guy Miso. Deck. Lydell Scott Jr., James Martin, Victor Laroux, Rune Brokstad, Ariuse Bryant, Jonah Wheeler, T-Mac, XXHJRX3A7XX, Hyperbeams, Michael Murphy, Grand Region Kell, Sin Hunter, Logan Bland, Alexander Johannes, Alex Morgan, Ray Various, That Other Guy Too, Chad Reynolds, T. Mackie 68 Rimuru, A. Zetros, Dweller of the Deepest Depths, Lone Wolf, Jacob Ropes, Bully Maguire Shadow, Rathakit Thitiratnun Fakul, Neostar Productions, Asael Cardenas, Shaquan Simmons, Thunder, Sunawin 631, Elijah Saunders, Peter Hamilton, Freddie Rose, Omega, Akuma Noakami, Remorsefuls, Blackvein, Joshua Hedrington, Aaron Abercrombie, Drift SK8ER, Corey Tokars, Jan, Devin Black, Crow, Joe Bros, Ray Von Crimson River, Dante Alastor, Adam Yonkers, Blood Saints, Donna Cafe, Zeph, KC, Howie 60, Ignacio. Hope of the universe, the ultimate guardians, celestial tier supporters whose impact literally shines across the galaxy. Void Rot, Chaos Umbre, Noroi Uzumaki Uchiha, Tyshawn Palmer, Coldbane 4, The Maniac 563, Debs, LS Morningstar, Marl, Spintown, I Shoot X50, Greg Green, James, Q Honyen Thompson, Juan, and Zeno KJ. What a ride! If this Phoenix Deku saga hit you like a supernova, smash like, subscribe for more wild what-ifs, and drop your favorite moment below. Thanks for watching, legends. Stay heroic, stay unhinged. Peace.